The night before our wedding, my fiancé secretly married his mistress. I pretended not to know and flew away that very night. 2 weeks later, the chief of surgery handed me a scalpel and said his life was entirely in my hands. He called me 868 times, but by then the game had already changed. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. My name is Paige. I am 30 years old, and I work as a cardiothoracic surgeon at Seattle General Hospital. For the past 3 years, my life was a grueling balancing act between saving lives in the operating room and trying to prove my worth to my fiancé, Spencer Montgomery, and his incredibly demanding family. I stood in the freezing rain, hidden by the dark shadows of the King County Courthouse. My shift had ended late, and I had rushed downtown to surprise Spencer, who claimed he was having a final legal consultation for our marriage paperwork. I brought his favorite coffee, intending to walk him back to our penthouse to finalize our vows. Instead, the coffee slipped from my hands, spilling into a puddle on the concrete. Just 10 feet away, under the glow of a street lamp, Spencer was passionately kissing Kelsey, a local socialite known for attending every high-profile charity gala in the city. Standing right beside them, holding a freshly stamped document, was Spencer's mother, Patricia. Patricia smiled widely, her voice carrying sharply through the cold night air. "The $50 million trust unlocks at midnight now that you are legally married to a proper woman, Spencer." She handed the paper to Kelsey, patting her shoulder affectionately. "Tomorrow, let that scrub-wearing, gold-digging surgeon walk down the aisle. We will cancel the wedding right at the altar in front of everyone. It is exactly what she deserves for trying to marry above her station." Spencer pulled away from Kelsey and laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that made my blood run cold. He wrapped his arm around Kelsey's waist, pulling her close. I cannot wait to see the look on Paige's face when she realizes she is walking down the aisle to nobody. She actually thought a Montgomery would marry a public school charity case just because she knows how to use a scalpel. I did not scream. I did not run out of the shadows to confront them. When you spend your days operating on beating hearts, you learn to maintain absolute control when things go wrong. Panic kills patience, and right now, panic would kill my dignity. I pulled my phone from my pocket, wiped the raindrops from the camera lens, and hit record. I zoomed in perfectly on the stamped marriage certificate in Patricia's hands, capturing the date, the signatures, and the triumphant smirk on my fake fiancé's face. I recorded their entire conversation in crystal clear, high definition. Once I had exactly what I needed, I turned on my heel and walked back into the rainy Seattle night. The ride back to our shared downtown penthouse was completely silent. I did not cry. My mind was already dissecting the situation with surgical precision. I thought about the grueling 14-hour shifts I worked at the hospital, standing on my feet until my back ached, holding people's lives in my hands. While I was analyzing echocardiograms and mastering the complex controls of the Aura robotic surgery system, Spencer was spending his days at the country club, waiting for his grandfather's trust fund to finally unlock. He had never worked a hard day in his life. He coasted on the Montgomery name, using his family's supposed wealth as a shield against any real responsibility. I had excused his lack of ambition because he played the supportive partner so well. It was all a calculated performance. I unlocked the door to the penthouse. The space was littered with wedding preparations. My custom silk gown hung in the center of the living room, a pristine white ghost, waiting for a tomorrow that would never happen. I walked straight past it and headed to the kitchen counter. I slipped the heavy diamond engagement ring off my finger. I had never examined it closely before, always trusting Spencer's claim that it was a flawless family heirloom. Holding it under the bright kitchen pendant lights, I tilted it back and forth. The light refracted poorly. There were no natural inclusions. It was a high-quality cubic zirconia set in sterling silver. Even the ring was a lie. I dropped the fake diamond into a half-empty glass of cheap champagne left on the counter from the night before. Patricia's cruel voice echoed in my head. She had spent the last 3 years reminding me that my parents were blue-collar workers who could never afford to attend her charity galas. She would invite me to high society luncheons just to highlight my lack of pedigree, watching with a tight artificial smile as I politely deflected her insults. I had endured her psychological abuse because I thought Spencer was worth it. I thought we were building a future together based on love, not a financial transaction designed to trigger a $50 million payout. I walked into the bedroom and pulled my largest suitcase from the closet. I did not take anything Spencer had bought me. I packed my medical journals, my scrubs, and the clothes I had purchased with my own hard-earned salary. As I zipped the suitcase closed, an intense clarity washed over me. I was not going to be the victim in their twisted high society game. I was going to let them choke on their own toxic plans. My phone suddenly rang, vibrating loudly against the nightstand. I glanced at the screen and saw an international number. It was the Global Medical Board calling from Geneva. 2 days ago, a renowned surgeon had fallen ill, and they desperately needed an emergency keynote speaker to present the latest advancements on the Aura robotic surgery system. I was the only specialist on the West Coast certified to handle that specific technology. I had initially declined the invitation because it conflicted with my wedding day. I answered the call on the second ring, my voice steady and professional. "This is Dr. Lawson." The board director sounded frantic on the other end, apologizing for the late hour and begging me to reconsider. "We have a first-class ticket waiting for you." "Dr. Lawson," he said, "but the flight leaves Seattle in exactly 2 hours. Can you make it?" I looked at the fake ring drowning in the cheap champagne. I looked at the empty closet where my old life used to be. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "I will be at the airport in 45 minutes. Send the boarding pass." I hung up the phone, grabbed the handle of my suitcase, and walked out the front door without looking back. The tires hissed against the slick Seattle pavement as I stared out the rain-streaked window. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and tapped my sister's name. It rang exactly once before Nicole answered. Her voice was thick with sleep, but the sharp edge of protective older sister instincts immediately cut through the fatigue. "Paige, it is 2 in the morning. What is wrong?" "Put me on speaker. I need Jamal." I heard the rustle of sheets and the sound of my brother-in-law waking up. Jamal was a brilliant forensic accountant with a mind like a steel trap. He had spent the last decade tearing apart corporate fraud cases, testifying in federal court, and tracing offshore shell companies for major law firms. More importantly, he was the only person in my life who had looked at Spencer Montgomery and immediately identified him as a textbook narcissist hiding behind a trust fund. "I am here, Paige." Jamal's deep voice resonated through the phone speaker, suddenly wide awake. "Talk to me." "Spencer just married Kelsey at the King County Courthouse." I watched Patricia hand them the stamped certificate. "They did it to unlock his $50 million grandfather clause before our wedding tomorrow. I need you to pull the county records right now." I heard the immediate clatter of a laptop opening. Jamal's fingers fired across his keyboard like a machine gun. Nicole gasped loudly. "He actually married her. That arrogant, entitled fraud actually did it." I kept my voice deadpan. "He did." And Patricia was right there celebrating. "They plan to let me walk down the aisle tomorrow just to publicly humiliate me and call off the wedding." "Got it," Jamal said, his tone dropping an octave into absolute business mode. The marriage license was filed electronically at 11:45 p.m. Spencer Thomas Montgomery and Kelsey Ann Vance. "It is legally binding. Paige, they played you." Nicole practically shouted into the receiver. "They played her. They have been treating you like a charity case for 3 years, Paige. Patricia paraded you around her country club friends like you were some sort of blue-collar rescue project. She constantly mocked your public school background while completely ignoring the fact that you are the youngest chief of cardiothoracic surgery in the entire state. Let them think they won," I said, watching the airport terminal approach in the distance. "I am currently in an Uber heading to SeaTac. The Global Medical Board just offered me an emergency keynote slot in Geneva. I am taking it." "Good," Jamal interjected, the rapid clicking of his keyboard not slowing down for a single second. "Because something is deeply wrong here. The Montgomerys have been bleeding their own manufacturing company dry for a decade. I ran a passive audit on their public filings 6 months ago just to be safe, and their liquid assets are practically non-existent. They live entirely on credit and leveraged properties. Why would he need to marry Kelsey in secret to unlock the trust? Nicole asked. Why not just marry Paige tomorrow and get the 50 million anyway? Because there is a catch, Jamal said. There is always a catch with money like this. Let me dig into the exact legal structure of this trust fund. If Patricia orchestrated this midnight courthouse stunt, she is hiding something massive. You go to Switzerland, Paige. Give that keynote presentation. Let me tear their financial lives apart piece by piece while you are in the air. I will call you when I land, I told them, feeling a massive weight lift off my chest. Thank you. The Uber pulled up to the international departures curb. I grabbed my suitcase, paid the driver, and walked through the sliding glass doors into the brightly lit terminal. The VIP check-in lane was completely empty. The attendant printed my boarding pass with a warm smile, noting the first-class designation paid for entirely by the Global Medical Board. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting in the exclusive airline lounge sipping sparkling water and watching the rain batter the large tarmac windows. When boarding was announced, I settled into my private pod at the front of the aircraft. The flight attendant offered me a warm towel and a glass of champagne. I accepted both. This was the life I had earned through grueling 14-hour surgical shifts, endless medical residencies, and relentless dedication to my craft. I did not need Spencer Montgomery's imaginary millions to fly first class or command respect on a global stage. As the heavy aircraft lifted off the runway, pushing me back into the plush leather seat, I finally allowed myself to relax. I turned my phone to airplane mode, cutting off all communication with Seattle. For the next 10 hours, I was unreachable. I reviewed my presentation notes on the Aura robotic system, slept soundly for the first time in months, and let the Montgomery family wake up to the spectacular mess they had created for themselves. The morning sun was blindingly bright as it reflected off the snow-capped Swiss Alps. I sat by the window of my luxury suite in Geneva, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, holding a demi-tasse of rich espresso. I took a slow sip, savoring the bitter, robust flavor. The conference was set to begin in 3 hours. I picked up my phone from the glass coffee table and turned off airplane mode. The device vibrated so hard it nearly slipped from my hand. The screen lit up with a chaotic flood of notifications. Texts, missed calls, and voicemails poured in like an avalanche. Spencer had finally woken up and realized the penthouse closet was half empty. His texts went from confused to angry to begging in the span of 2 hours. But the notification that caught my eye was a voicemail from Patricia. I tapped the play icon and held the speaker to my ear. Her voice was shrill, echoing with the kind of unfiltered rage that comes from a narcissist losing control of their narrative. "You ungrateful brat!" Her voice shrieked through the tiny speaker. "How dare you! You humiliated us by running away on the morning of the wedding. We had 500 guests expecting a ceremony, and you cowardly slipped out in the middle of the night. You have ruined my son's life. Do not think you can just escape to Europe and hide from us. I know the chairman of your hospital board personally. I am calling him right now, and I will have your medical license revoked before you land." I deleted the voicemail before Patricia could take another venomous breath. I tossed my phone onto the glass vanity of my luxury hotel suite, completely ignoring her empty threats. Let her call the hospital chairman. She had no idea that my emergency trip to Geneva was not just a speaking engagement. I was also finalizing the paperwork to become the majority shareholder of Aura Medical Tech, the very company that supplied Seattle General with its robotic surgical equipment. I essentially owned the surgical wing, now a fact Patricia was blissfully unaware of. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit, grabbed my presentation notes, and headed downstairs to the conference center. Stepping onto the stage at the Palais des Nations felt like stepping into another dimension. The blinding spotlights hit my face, illuminating an audience of 3,000 top-tier medical professionals from around the globe. I did not falter. For 90 minutes, I completely commanded the room. I projected high-resolution surgical footage onto the massive screens, demonstrating how the robotic arms could navigate treacherous vascular anomalies while maintaining perfect hemodynamic stability. I detailed the microscopic precision of the aura system, explaining how we could now repair complex aortic dissections and congenital heart defects with a 98% success rate. I spoke about the mechanics of human survival, breaking down the exact procedures required to keep a failing heart beating against all odds. As I concluded my keynote, the entire auditorium erupted into a standing ovation. In that moment, surrounded by international acclaim, the petty, manufactured drama of the Montgomery family felt entirely insignificant. But the Montgomerys were not finished playing their games. I walked off the stage and accepted a glass of water from a conference coordinator, finally checking my phone. My sister Nicole had sent me 32 messages in the span of an hour. The local Seattle news cycle had caught wind of the canceled high society wedding, and Patricia had immediately gone on the offensive. Instead of admitting the truth, Patricia and Spencer had launched a coordinated, vicious smear campaign to protect their social standing. Nicole sent me a link to a prominent Seattle lifestyle blog. The headline read, "Tragedy at the Altar Surgeon Fiancé. Suffers mental breakdown. Flees with priceless heirloom." I clicked the video embedded in the article. There was Patricia standing outside the very church where we were supposed to be married, pressing a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes. She looked directly into the camera and lied with the terrifying ease of a seasoned sociopath. She claimed the pressure of marrying into the Montgomery legacy had simply been too much for a woman of my modest blue-collar background. She spun a fabricated tale about me suffering a severe psychotic break, stealing what she called a priceless, flawless family diamond ring, and fleeing the country with a junior scrub nurse. She even claimed they were filing a police report to make the lie sound legitimate. The second link Nicole sent made my blood boil. It was an Instagram live broadcast from Kelsey. The socialite was sitting right in the middle of the penthouse living room, perched on the custom Italian leather sofa I had purchased with my own surgical salary. Kelsey was wearing one of Spencer's oversized cashmere sweaters, playing the role of the devoted savior. She stared mournfully into her front-facing camera, thanking her thousands of followers for their prayers and support. She explained that she had temporarily moved into the penthouse as a supportive friend, just trying to help Spencer heal his broken heart after his cruel gold-digging fiancé abandoned him. She actually had the audacity to wipe away a fake tear while sitting in my home, promising to stand by Spencer's side through this dark chapter. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. Nicole was practically screaming before I even brought the device to my ear. "Are you seeing this absolute garbage right now? I swear to God. Paige, give me the green light. I have the high-definition video you took outside the courthouse last night. I will send it to every news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. I will ruin them before lunch." I paced the length of the green room, my mind operating with the cold, detached logic I used in the operating theater. "No," I commanded, my voice entirely steady. "Do not post the video. Do not respond to any comments. Do not speak to the press." "Paige, are you out of your mind?" Nicole demanded, her voice vibrating with protective rage. "They are destroying your reputation. They are calling you a thief and a lunatic on the internet. You cannot just let them win." "I am not letting them win, Nicole. I am letting them commit to the lie. Think about it like a malignant tumor. If you just scrape the surface, the roots remain, and the cancer comes back twice as aggressive. You have to map the entire blood supply. You have to let the margins expose themselves before you cut the whole thing out permanently." Patricia and Spencer are building a massive house of cards on public television. Every interview they give, every fake tear Kelsey cries is another layer of fraud. When I finally kick the foundation out from under them, the collapse will be so spectacular they will never recover. Let them dig their own graves. Before Nicole could argue further, a harsh electronic chime interrupted the call. It was Jamal merging the call using his encrypted network line. His voice was breathless, carrying the distinct adrenaline rush of a man who had just struck gold. "Paige, do not say a single word about the smear campaign," Jamal ordered, the sound of furious typing echoing through the connection. "I do not care what they are saying to the press, because none of it matters anymore. I spent the last 8 hours hacking through 4 layers of offshore shell companies and deliberately obscured tax filings. I finally cracked the exact structure of the Montgomery Family Trust Fund. I stopped pacing. What did you find? Jamal let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. That $50 million account Patricia keeps bragging about. It is not an asset. It is a trap. The Montgomerys are completely bankrupt. They have been running a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme. They have been embezzling from their own investors for a decade to maintain their fake billionaire lifestyle, and the entire trust is leveraged against toxic, defaulted corporate debt. The grandfather clause did not unlock a fortune. It unlocked massive legal liability. By signing that marriage certificate at the courthouse last night, Kelsey did not marry into wealth. She just legally signed herself onto $50 million of federal fraud debt. The ink was barely dry on the acquisition papers. I sat in the glass-walled boardroom overlooking Lake Geneva, sliding the final signed contract across the mahogany table. As of 2 minutes ago, I was not just a keynote speaker. I was the majority shareholder of Aura Medical Tech. The Swiss executive stood up, clapping politely, welcoming me to the board. I smiled, shaking hands, feeling the solid weight of a victory that nobody could ever take away from me. I had secured my future, and I had done it entirely on my own terms without any compromises. My assistant for the week, a sharp young woman named Clara, rushed into the room. Her face was pale. She held out my personal phone. It had been on silent during the 4-hour negotiation. "Dr. Lawson," she whispered urgently, "I am so sorry to interrupt, but your phone has not stopped vibrating since lunch. I think there is an emergency." I took the device from her hands and looked at the screen. The notification counter was a solid block of red. 868 missed calls. My heart skipped a single beat before my training kicked in, suppressing any immediate panic. I walked out of the boardroom and down the quiet carpeted hallway to look at the call log. The numbers were a rapid-fire sequence of Seattle area codes. 50 calls from Spencer, 120 from Patricia. The rest were a mix of unknown numbers and an overwhelming flood from the Seattle General Hospital Executive Office. The voicemails were stacking up faster than the system could process them. I tapped the most recent audio message from Patricia. Yesterday, she was calling me a gold-digging public school charity case on national television. Today, her voice was a ragged, high-pitched shriek. "Paige, please answer the phone." Patricia sobbed into the receiver, the sound of medical alarms blaring loudly in the background. "Please, I am begging you. They say he is dying. They say nobody else can fix it. You have to come back. I will retract everything I said to the media. I will pay you whatever you want. Just pick up the phone." I deleted the voicemail before she could finish crying. I did not care about her apologies. They were born of absolute desperation, not genuine remorse. But the sheer volume of calls from the hospital director, Dr. Aris, meant this was not a manipulation tactic. This was a legitimate code blue. Before I could dial his number, the screen flashed with another incoming call from Dr. Aris. I accepted it and brought the phone to my ear. "Dr. Lawson, thank God." Dr. Aris sounded completely out of breath, as if he had been sprinting down the intensive care corridors. "We have a catastrophic situation here in Seattle." I leaned against the cool glass of the hallway window. "Give me the clinical rundown." "It is Spencer Montgomery," Dr. Aris said, his voice trembling with a panic I had never heard from the veteran administrator. There was a massive multi-car pileup on the Interstate 5 just south of downtown. A commercial semi-truck crossed the median. Spencer's sports car was crushed. He was extracted with the jaws of life 30 minutes ago. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "What are the exact injuries?" "Severe blunt force trauma to the chest cavity, resulting in a massive aortic dissection. The tear is propagating down the descending aorta, but that is not even the worst part. We got him on the table and rushed a scan. Spencer has an underlying congenital defect. His vascular tissue is incredibly frail, completely atypical. It is a ticking time bomb." My mind immediately pulled up the anatomical map of a human heart. A congenital tissue defect, combined with a traumatic dissection, was a surgical nightmare scenario. Any traditional open-chest surgical approach would likely cause the weakened blood vessels to shred completely upon clamping. The patient would bleed out on the operating table in seconds. "Who is the attending surgeon right now?" I asked. "That is why I am calling you Dr. Aris," said his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. Evans and Carmichael were on call. They opened him up, saw the tissue degradation, and immediately backed away. They are refusing to proceed. They say the mortality rate is 95%. Legally and ethically, they consider him inoperable with standard instruments. They have him packed and on bypass, but he is crashing fast. The internal bleeding is escalating rapidly. Of course, they backed away. Evans and Carmichael were brilliant, but they were traditionalists. They cared deeply about their success metrics. Nobody wants to touch a high-profile heir with a 95% mortality rate. A death on the table means a massive lawsuit, especially with a family as notoriously litigious and vicious as the Montgomerys. Patricia is out in the waiting room threatening to sue the entire hospital network if we let her son die. Dr. Aris continued, the stress evident in every single syllable. She is screaming at the nursing staff. The press is already picking up the accident details from the police scanners. It is an absolute circus down here, Paige. Tell Evans to manage the bypass and keep the blood pressure as low as humanly possible. I ordered, my brain shifting into complete surgical command. Do not let them try to clamp that aorta. Paige, you are the only surgeon on the West Coast certified to use the Aura robotic system for this specific anomaly. The director pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. The robotic microsutures are the only way to repair that fragile tissue without tearing it apart. We need your hands on those controls immediately. If you do not fly back tonight, he will be dead by tomorrow morning. I stood in the luxurious Swiss hallway, holding the fate of the man who had tried to destroy me in the palm of my hand. 2 weeks ago, Spencer Montgomery had stood outside a courthouse mocking my career, laughing about how he was going to humiliate me at the altar. Now his chest was cracked open on an operating table, his blood spilling onto the floor, and all his millions could not buy him a single surgeon willing to save his life. The $50 million trust fund could not buy a new aorta. Kelsey could not bat her eyelashes and charm the Grim Reaper. Patricia's elite country club socialite connections could not bribe a flatline monitor into beating again. The universe had an incredible sense of absolute irony. I did not owe Spencer anything. I owed Patricia even less, but I was not going to let them control the narrative anymore. If Spencer died tonight, Patricia would spend the rest of her life playing the grieving mother, spinning a story where her perfect son was taken too soon. She would probably blame my absence for his stress and subsequent accident. I refused to give her that kind of martyrdom. I wanted Spencer to live. I wanted him to wake up and face the absolute financial ruin Jamal was currently orchestrating. I wanted him to look me in the eye and know that his survival was granted by the exact same woman he called a public school charity case. "Dr. Aris," I said, my voice echoing coldly against the glass window. "Have the surgical team prep the Aura robot. Tell them to calibrate the microforceps for delicate vascular tissue. I am chartering a private medical transport jet right now. I will be in the operating room in exactly 11 hours. Keep him alive until I get there." "Thank you. Thank you, Paige. I will alert the team immediately." I hung up the phone and walked back into the boardroom. Clara was standing near the heavy wooden doors, looking deeply concerned. I handed her the phone. "Clara, I need a direct flight back to Seattle immediately. Call air traffic control and clear a path. We have a dying heart to repair." The 11-hour flight from Geneva to Seattle was a blur of atmospheric turbulence and hyper-focused preparation. I spent the entire journey analyzing Spencer's digital scans on my secure tablet, meticulously mapping out the exact vascular pathways I would need to navigate using the Aura system. When the private medical transport jet touched down at Boeing Field, a chopper was already waiting on the tarmac, its blades spinning violently in the torrential Seattle rain. I bypassed the terminal, completely sprinting across the wet asphalt and strapping into the helicopter. During the short, aggressive flight to the hospital roof, I stripped off my tailored suit and changed into my dark blue surgical scrubs. I secured my hair, checked my pager, and entered the sterile, detached headspace required to cheat death. The chopper touched down on the reinforced roof of Seattle General with a heavy thud. I ducked under the deafening rotors, pushed through the heavy metal fire doors, and took the service elevator straight down to the surgical intensive care lobby. The doors slid open to reveal a scene of absolute chaos. Hospital security officers were forming a desperate human barricade against a swarm of local reporters and camera crews, all of them hungry for an update on the city's most scandalous heir. Flashbulbs illuminated the waiting area in jagged bursts of white light. But my eyes locked immediately on the center of the room. Patricia Montgomery looked nothing like the polished, ruthless matriarch who had berated me at the courthouse 2 weeks ago. Her custom Chanel dress was severely wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Her immaculate highlighted hairstyle had unraveled into a chaotic, tangled mess, and her expensive mascara was smeared in dark, jagged streaks down her pale cheeks. She was pacing the waiting room floor like a trapped animal clutching her phone with white knuckles. The moment she spotted my dark blue scrubs stepping out of the elevator, her entire demeanor shifted. She did not hesitate. She did not try to maintain her aristocratic dignity in front of the flashing cameras. Patricia sprinted across the polished linoleum floor and threw herself at my feet. She physically dropped to her knees right in front of the security desk, her hands desperately grabbing the fabric of my scrubs. "Save my boy," Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking loudly enough for the press pool to record every single word. "Please, Paige, I will give you anything. I will write you a blank check right now. I am so sorry for what we said to the press. We lied. I will go on television tomorrow and tell them we made it all up to protect his image. Just save my son. Please." I looked down at the woman who had spent 3 grueling years trying to make me feel completely worthless. I felt no anger. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing. I took a deliberate cold step backward, forcing her shaking hands to slip off my uniform. "Get off the floor, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the lobby chatter like a surgical blade. "You are contaminating my sterile field, and your money is entirely useless to me." Before Patricia could formulate a response or attempt to grab me again, Dr. Aris and Dr. Evans burst through the double doors of the surgical wing. Evans looked exhausted, his surgical gown speckled with fresh blood. Dr. Lawson Evans said, rushing toward me with a heavy plastic clipboard clutched to his chest. "His blood pressure is tanking rapidly. The congenital tissue degradation is significantly worse than the initial scans showed. The aortic wall is essentially turning to wet tissue paper under the stress of the internal bleeding. If we do not initiate the robotic bypass sequence in the next 4 minutes, he will bleed out into his chest cavity. I need the high-risk consent forms signed right now before you can prep the robot." Patricia scrambled up from the floor, her hands shaking violently as she reached for the clipboard. "Give me the pen," she demanded, her maternal panic briefly replacing her utter humiliation. "I am his mother. I will sign whatever you need. Do it. Give it to me." I reached out and intercepted the clipboard, pulling it smoothly out of Patricia's grasp before she could touch the paper. I held the pen firmly in my right hand, looking her dead in the eye. "You cannot sign this, Patricia." Patricia stared at me in pure horror, her breath hitching in her throat. "What are you talking about? I am his mother. I have always made his medical decisions." "Not anymore," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing clearly through the silent hospital lobby. "Hospital policy strictly dictates that for any experimental or high-risk procedure carrying a 95% mortality rate, the medical proxy automatically falls to the patient's legal spouse. A mother's signature is legally void if the patient is married. The liability must be assumed by his legal partner." I turned away from Patricia and swept my piercing gaze across the waiting room. Hiding in the far corner, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and trembling violently, was the woman who had proudly declared herself Spencer's savior on Instagram just days ago. Kelsey looked absolutely terrified, shrinking against the wall as if she wanted to disappear into the drywall. She had wanted the fame, the penthouse, and the imaginary $50 million trust fund. Now she was staring down the barrel of massive federal fraud debt and a legal document that would make her personally responsible if Spencer died on my operating table. "Step up, Kelsey!" I commanded, my voice echoing clearly through the silent hospital lobby. Your husband needs you. Kelsey pressed her spine against the sterile white wall of the intensive care lobby, shrinking back as if the heavy plastic clipboard in my hand were a loaded weapon. Her oversized designer sunglasses slipped down the bridge of her nose, revealing eyes completely devoid of the performative sorrow she had just broadcasted to thousands of followers. She shook her head rapidly, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling. The entire surgical wing fell into a deafening silence. Dr. Evans lowered his hands, his exhausted face registering absolute shock. Dr. Aris stared at the two women with wide eyes. The attending nurses behind the security desk exchanged baffled glances. The pristine narrative Patricia had carefully spoon-fed to the local media, the devastated mother and the supportive platonic friend, evaporated instantly under the harsh fluorescent hospital lights. Patricia's tear-stained face twisted into a mask of pure confusion, then rapidly morphed into sheer terror as she realized I held all the cards. I knew about the midnight courthouse visit. I knew about the marriage certificate. She whipped her head around to face the cornered socialite. Did you hear her? Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a frantic, unhinged edge. Take the pen, Kelsey. Sign the paper right now so she can save him. No. Kelsey whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic beeping of the trauma bay monitors down the hall. Her eyes darted wildly between Patricia the clipboard and the heavy double doors leading to the operating theater. I cannot do it. Dr. Evans stepped forward, the fresh blood on his surgical gown a stark reminder of the ticking clock. Ladies, we do not have time for a family dispute. The patient's systolic pressure is bottoming out. The aortic wall is actively shearing as we speak. We are talking about minutes before the tear reaches the aortic root. If we do not get that signature immediately, we are moving to palliative care. He will die on that table. Patricia lunged forward and grabbed Kelsey by the arm, her immaculate fingernails digging viciously into the cashmere of Spencer's stolen sweater. What is wrong with you, Patricia? Demanded, her voice dropping into a desperate, guttural whisper that carried clearly across the quiet lobby. He is your husband. You just married him to secure the trust. Sign the form and let her fix him. Kelsey violently ripped her arm away from her mother-in-law. I maintained my position, an immovable object in dark blue scrubs, watching the two women tear each other apart. I did not offer the pen again. I simply let the silence draw out the poison. You do not understand how the legal system works. Patricia Kelsey fired back, her tone suddenly shifting from terrified to ruthlessly pragmatic. I was texting my lawyer while you were crying for the cameras. Do you know what happens if I authorize a highly experimental robotic surgery with a 95% mortality rate and he dies on the table? Patricia stared at her, completely uncomprehending. He is dying right now. If he dies under the knife during an unauthorized or high-risk procedure, Kelsey snapped, her true colors shining blindingly bright. The insurance companies and the hospital board mandate a massive medical and legal review. The trust fund, the offshore accounts, the life insurance, everything gets frozen in probate and federal review for 3 to 5 years while the lawyers tear the surgical logs apart to determine liability. I get nothing while I am tied up in endless litigation. The absolute horror of the situation began to dawn on Patricia. She took a slow, unsteady step back from the woman she had personally chosen to replace me. But Kelsey continued, her eyes cold and calculating, as she did the math out loud. If he dies naturally right now, because his injuries were simply too severe to operate on. If the legal spouse declines the extreme intervention and opts for compassionate care, the payout is immediate. It is clean. It is completely untouchable. I get the money deposited into my accounts as the grieving widow before the dirt even settles on his grave. You selfish little brat! Patricia breathed, her voice shaking with a realization that was tearing her reality to shreds. The monster she had orchestrated the fake marriage to, unlock the grandfather clause, was now actively choosing to let her son bleed to death. You would let my boy die. I am not risking my $50 million on a 5% survival chance. Kelsey screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings, utterly remorseless. I will not sign it. Let him die. The sound that ripped from Patricia's throat was not human. It was a feral, agonizing shriek of a mother watching her child being murdered by her own toxic greed. She completely snapped. Patricia lunged at Kelsey with terrifying speed, slamming the younger woman back against the drywall. Patricia's hands clamped directly around Kelsey's throat, her thumbs pressing into her windpipe. Kelsey thrashed wildly, her designer sunglasses flying off and shattering on the linoleum floor. She clawed at Patricia's face, choking and gasping for air as the older woman pinned her with the strength of absolute madness. Hospital security guards shouted, sprinting from behind the desk to rip the two women apart, but Patricia held on with a death grip, screaming incoherently. In the midst of the violent struggle, the heavy crash cart doors of the trauma bay swung violently open. The commotion in the lobby abruptly halted. The rhythmic, terrifying blare of the intensive care monitors spilled out into the hallway. Two trauma nurses were rushing a cart of fresh blood products toward the bay, leaving an unobstructed view directly into the sterile room. Spencer was lying on the operating table, his chest packed with sterile gauze, surrounded by an absolute sea of crimson. But he was not sedated. The paralytics had worn off as his blood pressure crashed, and the emergency epinephrine had forcefully shocked his system. His eyes were open. They were wide, bloodshot, and fixed directly on the hallway. Spencer Montgomery had regained consciousness just long enough to look through the open doors and hear his brand-new, hand-picked wife actively screaming her refusal to save his life in exchange for $50 million. Two burly hospital security guards crashed into Patricia, ripping her hands away from Kelsey's throat. Patricia fought like a rabid animal, her designer heels slipping on the polished linoleum as they dragged her backward. Kelsey collapsed against the baseboard, violently coughing and clutching her bruised neck. Inside the trauma bay, the chaos momentarily suspended. Spencer's wide, bloodshot eyes moved past his mother, past his struggling new wife, and locked directly onto mine. In that fraction of a second, the heavy veil of his arrogance completely dissolved. He saw Kelsey cowering in the corner, clutching her throat after explicitly choosing her payout over his survival. He saw me standing tall in my dark blue scrubs, the only person capable of pulling him back from the brink. The sheer, absolute terror of his reality finally registered. His chest heaved in a jagged, unnatural spasm. The cardiac monitor suddenly shifted from a rapid, erratic rhythm to a solid, piercing, continuous tone. V-fib. "He is coding," a trauma nurse shouted, instantly jumping onto a stool and launching into aggressive chest compressions. The sickening crack of Spencer's ribs breaking echoed into the lobby as the nurse fought to manually pump his failing heart. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. Charge the paddles to 200. Dr. Evans stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed, his hands raised in the air, his eyes darting frantically toward the lobby. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice laced with pure administrative panic. "Stop the line. We do not have legal authorization." The medical proxy explicitly refused surgical and resuscitative intervention. "If we crack his chest and put him on the bypass circuit without spousal consent, this hospital will be buried in litigation." Kelsey staggered to her feet, her voice a ragged, raspy croak. "You heard him." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the trauma team. "I am his legal wife. I hold the proxy. I said do not touch him. Let nature take its course." She wanted the clean payout. She wanted the $50 million without the messy probate battle of a surgical complication. She was willing to stand there and watch the man she married 12 hours ago bleed out on a steel table. I stepped over the threshold, crossing from the chaotic public lobby into the sterile confines of the trauma bay. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, muting Patricia's muffled screams. I walked straight past the frantic administrator and positioned myself at the head of Spencer's bed. I looked down at his pale, sweat-slicked face as his body jolted from the chest compressions. "Push another milligram of epi," I commanded, my voice slicing through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel. "Prep the Aura robotic suite in OR4. Get the perfusionist online immediately. We are moving him." "Paige, you cannot do this," Dr. Evans protested, grabbing my arm. "It is legal suicide. She is the proxy. She gave a DNR directive." I shrugged off his hand with a sharp, forceful movement. Look at his tissue degradation, Evans. Look at the scans. This is an active catastrophic structural failure of a congenital anomaly, not a chronic terminal decline. I turned my head and locked eyes with Dr. Aris, who was sweating profusely by the door. Under the Emergency Medical Treatment Act, as the chief of cardiothoracic surgery of this hospital, I am executing a life-saving override. The patient presented to this trauma center in critical, actively deteriorating condition. The proxy's refusal is based on a clear conflict of financial interest, evidenced by a physical altercation in our lobby. I am invoking a two-physician override to bypass the proxy. Evans, you are my second. Do you concur that this patient will die in the next 3 minutes without immediate robotic intervention? Evans looked at the monitor, then at Spencer's rapidly bruising chest, and finally at me. He swallowed hard. I concur. Kelsey slammed her fists against the glass doors of the trauma bay. The automatic sensors triggered, sliding the doors open just enough for her to scream into the room. You cannot do this. You have no right. I will strip your medical license. I will sue you for every dime you have. I will ruin your entire life for violating my spousal rights. I slowly turned to face her. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply let the absolute weight of my authority fill the space between us. Sue me, I replied, my tone dropping to a deadly glacial calm. Take me to court, Kelsey. Try to explain to a judge why you wanted your husband to die while the chief of surgery was standing right here offering to save him. But right now I am saving this trash because my oath demands it, and because I want him awake for what comes next. I did not wait for her response. I spun around and gestured to the transport team. Move him. Now. The team sprang into action, unlocking the wheels of the trauma bed and rushing Spencer down the sterile corridor toward the surgical wing. I followed closely behind, stripping off my outer jacket and heading straight for the scrub sinks outside OR4. The heavy rhythmic sound of water rushing from the automated faucets grounded me. I scrubbed my hands and forearms with iodine, mentally preparing for the most complex vascular reconstruction of my career. I was about to navigate microscopic robotic arms through tissue paper veins to save a man who had treated me like dirt. Down the hallway, the heavy double doors of the surgical intensive care unit flew open with a violent crash. Jamal burst through the threshold, his long trench coat completely soaked from the Seattle rain. He was practically sprinting down the corridor, dodging a cart of fresh linens, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. In his right hand, he gripped a heavy metallic briefcase so tightly his knuckles were white. He spotted Nicole standing near the security desk, still shaken from the physical altercation between Patricia and Kelsey. Jamal closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He slammed the briefcase onto the reception counter, popped the dual locks, and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. Jamal pointed a highly commanding finger directly at the glass windows of OR4, where I was currently backing into my sterile surgical gown. Tell Paige she absolutely needs to save him, Jamal ordered, his deep voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the hospital. You tell her she cannot let his heart stop beating on that table. If Spencer dies tonight, all of his debts die with him. If he dies, he escapes the massive federal indictment I just triggered. Keep him alive, Nicole. He needs to wake up and face the feds. Nicole hit the heavy plastic button on the wall intercom, broadcasting her voice directly into the sterile confines of Operating Room 4. Jamal is here, she relayed, her words breathless, but carrying a sharp, triumphant edge. He just triggered the federal indictment. He says you absolutely must keep Spencer alive. If he dies tonight, the entire estate escapes the Department of Justice seizure. Keep his heart beating, Paige. He has to wake up and face the feds. I did not respond to the intercom. My hands were already strapped securely into the master control grips of the Aura robotic system. I stared straight into the high-definition 3-dimensional viewfinder, letting the bright surgical lights and the hum of the machines pull me into a state of absolute icy focus. The federal indictment was exactly what Jamal and I had orchestrated, a total financial annihilation of the Montgomery Empire. But right now, the DOJ was entirely secondary. Death was actively trying to steal my leverage, and I refused to lose my victory to a biological failure. The mangled, bloody landscape of Spencer Montgomery's chest cavity filled my entire field of vision. It was a catastrophic, anatomical nightmare. The blunt force trauma from the car wreck had shredded his chest, but the underlying congenital defect was the true enemy. His vascular tissue had the consistency of wet, dissolving tissue paper. Current patient vitals: systolic blood pressure, plummeting past 60 and dropping rapidly. Core temperature decreasing steadily on the bypass circuit. Aortic integrity severely compromised, presenting massive, actively shearing lacerations. The aura system seamlessly translated my gross hand movements into microscopic tremor-free actions at the surgical site. I navigated the tiny robotic camera past the fractured ribs and the heavy pooling of dark blood. Above me, a violent rhythmic thudding suddenly began to echo through the operating room. I did not pull my eyes away from the digital screen, but I could hear the heavy thumps vibrating through the ceiling panels. Patricia Montgomery had somehow evaded the hospital security team long enough to reach the second-floor observation gallery. She was relentlessly slamming her open palms against the thick, reinforced glass window overlooking the surgical theater. Even through the heavy soundproofing and the mechanical hum of the bypass pumps, her unhinged shrieks penetrated the sterile environment. She is intentionally murdering him. Stop the surgery right now. She is doing this out of spite because he left her. That public school charity case is executing my son out of pure jealousy. Stop her. Patricia hammered her fists against the pane until her knuckles bled. Her face pressed flush against the glass, contorted into a mask of pure feral hysteria. She pointed directly down at the robotic console, where I sat in the darkened corner of the room. "Get her out of there immediately," Dr. Evans ordered, looking up from the operating table where he was managing the manual suction wands. "Call security and have her dragged out of this hospital in handcuffs." The circulating nurse grabbed the wall-mounted telephone. "Mrs. Montgomery, step away from the observation glass right now." Her voice boomed authoritatively through the gallery intercom system. "Hospital security and the Seattle Police Department are breaching the stairs. You will be arrested and charged with interfering with a critical life-saving procedure." I completely blocked out the pounding. I blocked out the screaming echoing from the gallery. I blocked out the knowledge that Kelsey was sitting down in the ICU lobby, eagerly praying for my failure so she could collect a clean, undisputed $50 million widow's inheritance. I reduced my entire existence to the microscopic movements of the robotic forceps and the rhythmic failing pulse of the shredded aorta. The damaged vessel throbbed weakly on the screen, a ragged, deteriorating hose struggling to push volume through a massive tear. I deployed the robotic micro-sutures, adjusting the grip tension on my hand controls. Immediate surgical strategy: isolate and bypass the proximal arch. Apply a synthetic polygraft material to reinforce the highly friable native tissue. Execute a continuous microscopic suture line without tearing the compromised vessel wall. I grabbed the first edge of the torn tissue with the robotic grasper. It instantly began to dissolve and fray under the minimal pressure. I quickly engaged the foot pedals to adjust the tension algorithms on the aura system, dropping the tactile force feedback to its lowest absolute setting. It was exactly like trying to sew water together. "Blood pressure is dropping again," the anesthesiologist called out from the head of the table, his eyes glued to the cascading red numbers on his monitor. "He is actively bleeding out from the descending tear. The native tissue is not holding the pressure. Increase the flow on the bypass pump." I instructed, my fingers moving in a rapid, highly calculated dance. "Keep his core temperature low to protect the brain. I am laying down the synthetic graft right now." I guided the artificial patch into place over the largest, most critical rupture. Every single millimeter of movement required absolute flawless perfection. One wrong twitch, one fraction of a millimeter of overcorrection, and the entire vessel would split completely open from the root straight down to the abdomen. The thumping on the glass above grew wildly erratic as security officers finally breached the observation deck. Out of my peripheral vision, I could see two large, uniformed guards physically wrestling Patricia away from the window, dragging her backward across the floor as she kicked and scratched at them like a wildcat. Her final muffled scream echoed through the thick glass just as the heavy wooden doors of the gallery sealed firmly shut behind her. The operating room immediately descended back into a tense, highly focused silence. The only sounds were the mechanical breathing of the ventilator and the increasingly frantic, rapid beeps of the cardiac monitor. "I have the primary tear covered," I announced, smoothly pulling the first microsuture through the synthetic patch and anchoring it, preparing to close the secondary laceration. The tissue is extremely thin here. Evans prepared to increase the manual suction on my mark. "Ready," Evans confirmed, his gloved hands hovering directly over the open chest cavity, holding the heavy plastic suction tubes. I maneuvered the robotic needle driver into position. I needed to catch just enough of the healthy tissue to anchor the stitch while completely avoiding the degraded dying areas. I found the perfect anchor point. I initiated the drive. The needle pierced the tissue. For a single microsecond, the vessel wall held, and then the congenital weakness gave way completely. The underlying tissue did not just tear, it structurally disintegrated. A massive, catastrophic rupture ripped vertically down the descending aorta, shredding right through the native tissue and completely bypassing my carefully placed synthetic graft. A high-pressure, violent geyser of dark arterial blood exploded upward, hitting the robotic camera lens directly. The three-dimensional high-definition view inside my console instantly went completely crimson. The screen was blindingly red. I was flying blind in a sea of blood. Rupture Evans yelled, his hands desperately plunging into the chest cavity with the suction wands. The tools were instantly overwhelmed by the sheer terrifying volume of the hemorrhage. Massive rupture. The entire aortic wall just gave way. "I cannot see the surgical field," I shouted, ripping my head out of the robotic console and sprinting the 3 steps to the actual operating table. "Flush the cavity with saline. Give me manual vascular clamps right now. Blood pressure is bottoming out." The anesthesiologist screamed over the sudden frantic chaos, his hands flying across the medication dials. "Pressure is 40 over palpable. 30, 20. We are losing him." I grabbed a heavy stainless steel vascular clamp from the scrub tech, thrusting my hands directly into the pooling hot blood inside Spencer's cracked chest, desperately feeling for the source of the rupture blindly. It was a torrential flood. The warm blood soaked straight through my sterile gown, coating my forearms. "He has no pressure," the anesthesiologist yelled. "He is gone." The erratic, frantic beeping of the cardiac monitor suddenly flatlined. The machine emitted a sustained, terrifying, continuous beep that filled every corner of the operating room. I plunged both hands deeper into the pooling heat of his chest cavity. The continuous tone of the flatline monitor was a drill boring directly into my skull, but panic was a luxury I could not afford. My fingers slipped past the shredded remnants of the aorta and locked firmly around the slick, muscular mass of Spencer Montgomery's heart. It was completely still, a useless, flaccid muscle failing its only fundamental task. I clamped my palms around the ventricles and squeezed. 1, 2, 3, 4. I established a brutal, punishing rhythm. Manual open-chest cardiac massage is not a graceful medical procedure. It is a violent, exhausting physical assault against death itself. I compressed his heart, forcing the blood out of the chambers and manually pumping it into his starved brain. "Give me another milligram of epinephrine." I barked, my voice harsh and breathless. "Keep the suction going. Find the distal end of the rupture." Still flatlined, the anesthesiologist reported, his tone grim. 3 minutes. I adjusted my grip, my arms aching from the sheer physical exertion of pumping another human being's heart. Spencer's blood coated my forearms, soaking through the sterile gown, dripping onto my boots. This was the man who had mocked my ambition, who had laughed at my background, who had tried to erase my career to protect his fragile ego. And now his literal existence depended entirely on the strength of my hands. 4 minutes, the anesthesiologist called out. "Pupils are sluggish. Keep pushing meds," I ordered. I squeezed harder, locking my jaw. I refused to let him die. Not here. Not before he had to open his eyes and face the absolute ruin Jamal was orchestrating for him. I rhythmically compressed the organ, ignoring the burning lactic acid building in my shoulders. Every squeeze was a defiance of the odds, a direct challenge to the universe that had handed Spencer everything on a silver platter. I was not going to let him escape his consequences. 7 minutes. Paige, we are losing the window. Dr. Evans hesitated, stepping back from the table. I said, keep suctioning, I snarled. He does not get the easy way out. 10 agonizing, bone-crushing minutes passed. My scrubs were heavy with sweat and blood. My hands were cramping, and then against my palms, I felt a flutter. It was weak, erratic, a tiny spasm of electrical activity trying to reassert command. I have a rhythm. I gasped, holding my hands perfectly still to let the heart expand. Look at the monitor. The sustained, terrifying beep broke. A jagged, uneven line spiked across the digital screen, followed by another. The rhythm stabilized, growing stronger with each passing second. Pressure is rising, the anesthesiologist said, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief. 60/40. 70/50. We have a pulse. He is back. Clamp the descending artery, I instructed Evans, my breath coming in heavy heaves. Let us finish this repair. He belongs to the living now. Beyond the heavy, soundproofed doors of the surgical suite, the blaring code blue alarm echoed sharply through the intensive care lobby. The flashing red strobe lights bathed the sterile walls in an emergency glow. Nurses sprinted down the corridor, wheeling a secondary crash cart toward OR4. Kelsey watched the frantic medical staff from her corner of the waiting room. The panic was palpable. The sheer speed of the nurses and the terrifying wail of the alarm communicated a very clear, undeniable message to anyone watching. The patient was crashing. Kelsey slowly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. She did not cry. She did not rush to the security desk to beg for an update. She unlocked her screen, her manicured thumb tapping swiftly through her contacts. She pressed the phone to her ear, a slow, highly satisfied smirk creeping across her flawless face. Marcus, Kelsey said, her voice dropping into a sultry, arrogant purr that carried clearly across the quiet, tense lobby. It is Kelsey. Yes, Kelsey Montgomery now. I am calling about that waterfront property in Medina, the $10 million listing. Nicole stood 20 feet away, frozen in place, a cup of untouched coffee in her hand. She stared at the new bride in absolute sickening disbelief. I want to book a private viewing for tomorrow afternoon, Kelsey continued loudly and unapologetically pacing near the vending machines. Yes, I am prepared to make a cash offer over asking. My financial situation has just rapidly evolved. My husband's trust fund is releasing the assets immediately, the full $50 million. Let us just say I am stepping into my new role as an independent wealth manager very soon. Nicole slammed her coffee cup down on a side table. The hot liquid splashed over the edges, but she did not care. She crossed the lobby with the terrifying speed and purpose of a guided missile. I want the primary suite completely remodeled before I move in, Kelsey bragged into the receiver. And the yacht dock needs to be completely. Nicole slapped the phone entirely out of Kelsey's hand. The expensive device flew across the room, smashing into the drywall and clattering violently onto the linoleum floor. Kelsey gasped, spinning around to face Nicole with wide, furious eyes. What is wrong with you? Kelsey shrieked, clutching her hand. What is wrong with me? Nicole stepped directly into Kelsey's personal space, her voice a low, lethal hiss. Your husband's heart monitor is screaming a code blue down that hallway. There are surgeons literally fighting a war with death to save his life right this very second, and you are out here shopping for a $10 million mansion with his money. You have no right to touch my property, Kelsey snapped, trying to step around Nicole to retrieve her shattered phone. I am his wife. I have to prepare for the future. You are a parasite, Nicole fired back, blocking her path. You are not a grieving wife. You are a highly calculated predator waiting for a corpse to drop so you can cash a check. You stood there 10 minutes ago and actively refused to sign a consent form because you wanted him to die for the payout. You are banking on a flatline to fund your luxury real estate tour. I am securing what I am owed, Kelsey snarled, abandoning the fragile, tearful act entirely. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated greed. Spencer brought me into this mess. The Montgomery family dragged me into their drama. I married him and the 50 million is mine. If he is too weak to survive a surgery, that is his problem. I'm going to be rich and you are going to be stuck working a hospital reception desk. You are absolutely repulsive, Nicole said, her voice radiating pure disgust. You think you won the lottery. You think you outsmarted everyone. But you have no idea what is actually happening in this hospital tonight. Kelsey laughed, a harsh, grating sound. I know exactly what is happening. The alarm is blaring. He is dead. I am rich. And there is nothing you or that arrogant surgeon friend of yours can do to stop me from taking everything. The heavy automated doors of the surgical wing slid open with a sudden hydraulic hiss. The code blue alarm had ceased minutes ago, replaced by the standard quiet hum of the hospital corridors. I walked out of the restricted zone, my surgical cap pulled low, my dark blue scrubs heavily splattered with dark, drying arterial blood. The physical exhaustion radiated through every muscle in my body, but my mind was operating on pure adrenaline-fueled clarity. Kelsey's head snapped toward the doors. The arrogant, victorious sneer vanished from her face the absolute second she saw me. She instantly tried to pivot back into her performance, forcing her eyes to widen, bringing her hands up to cover her mouth, attempting to squeeze out a single manufactured tear. Dr. Lawson Kelsey cried out, her voice trembling with fake, breathless anxiety. Please tell me. The alarm. Is he dead? Is my husband gone? I stopped in the middle of the lobby. I looked at the shattered smartphone on the floor, then at Nicole's furious expression, and finally rested my gaze directly on Kelsey's perfectly contoured, violently desperate face. I let a slow, terrifyingly cold smirk spread across my lips. Cancel your mansion tour, Kelsey. My voice rang out clearly, echoing against the hard walls of the intensive care waiting room, shattering her meticulously calculated fantasy into a million pieces. Your husband is perfectly stable, I stated, locking my eyes with hers. His aorta is repaired, his vitals are strong, he is going to live. Kelsey's fake tears instantly stopped. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her chalky and pale. Her jaw went slack, her hands dropping limply to her sides, as the reality of my words crashed over her. She was not a wealthy widow. She was legally bound to a man who was about to wake up and remember that she had actively tried to sentence him to death for cash. Her face dropped into a mask of pure absolute horror. The rhythmic artificial sigh of the mechanical ventilator dominated the VIP recovery suite. I stood at the foot of the bed, my eyes tracking the jagged lines of the cardiac monitor. His blood pressure was holding steady at 110/70. The synthetic graft was performing flawlessly. Spencer Montgomery was alive. His eyelids fluttered, parting slowly against the harsh fluorescent glare of the room. He blinked, his gaze wandering aimlessly before locking onto my dark blue scrubs. The heavy surgical sedation was wearing off, leaving him tethered to a web of intravenous lines and thick plastic chest tubes, but his mind was rapidly snapping back to reality. He tried to shift his weight, wincing violently as the fresh sternotomy incisions pulled tight across his chest. I did not move to comfort him. I simply flipped the metal cover of his medical chart closed and waited. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored gasps. The arrogance that usually defined his entire existence had been completely stripped away, replaced by a hollow, terrified realization. His eyes welled with tears spilling over his pale cheeks and soaking into the crisp hospital pillowcase. Paige. He choked out his voice, a ragged, raspy whisper vibrating with pure panic. You saved me. I watched him struggle to pull oxygen into his healing lungs. I was so wrong, he cried weakly, raising a shaking hand toward me. Kelsey. I heard what she said in the trauma bay before I went under. She wanted me to die. She is a monster. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, just a cold, clinical detachment. You chose your path, Spencer, I replied evenly. I just made sure you lived long enough to walk it. Before he could form another word, the heavy wooden door to the VIP suite slammed open, crashing violently against the wall stopper. Patricia Montgomery stormed into the room like a hurricane. Her designer coat wrinkled her face flushed with manic fury. She did not rush to her son's side to check his condition. She marched directly toward me, throwing a sharp, forceful shove against my shoulder. "Get away from him!" she snarled, her voice vibrating with venom. "I know exactly what you are doing. You manipulated this entire situation. You dragged out his surgery just to play the hero, to make yourself look indispensable so you could crawl your way back into his wallet." Spencer weakly shook his head, the cardiac monitor beeping faster as his heart rate spiked in distress. "Mom, stop," he pleaded. "She saved my life. Kelsey tried to kill me." "She is brainwashing you," Patricia shrieked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "This public school trash orchestrated this entire crisis to make your new wife look bad." Kelsey was terrified. She was waiting outside praying for you, while this opportunistic hack tried to play God and hold your life hostage. She wants to ruin your marriage because she could never secure a ring for herself. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to the physical shove. I simply let her finish her unhinged rant, watching her chest heave with indignation. Then I calmly reached into my scrub pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped the screen. "The hospital security system records audio in all active trauma bays," I stated smoothly, turning the volume on my device to maximum. "Let us hear exactly how terrified your new daughter-in-law was." I pressed play. The crystal-clear audio recording filled the quiet recovery suite, cutting through the ambient noise of the medical equipment. Kelsey's voice echoed off the walls, sharp, impatient, and utterly devoid of empathy. "I am his legal wife. I hold the proxy. I said do not touch him. Let nature take its course." The recording captured Dr. Evans warning her about the fatal consequences, explicitly stating that Spencer would bleed to death without immediate surgical intervention. Then Kelsey's undeniable chilling response played for both Spencer and his mother to hear. "Let him bleed. The prenup guarantees me $50 million if he dies married to me. Do not interfere with my payout." Spencer choked back a heavy sob, his head falling back against the pillows as the undeniable proof of his new wife's murderous greed washed over him. The woman he had abandoned me for, the woman he had paraded around as his ultimate prize, had actively tried to sentence him to death for cash. Patricia's face flushed a deep mottled crimson. The muscles in her neck strained as she stared at the phone in my hand, her reality fracturing. Instead of accepting the truth, she doubled down on her delusion. "That is a fabrication," she screamed, lunging forward to snatch the device from my hand. "You faked that audio. You altered the hospital tapes to frame her. You malicious, jealous little liar." I stepped back effortlessly, slipping the phone back into my pocket before her clawing hands could reach it. "Your denial is impressive, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "But you are going to need a lot more than loud accusations for what happens next." Before Patricia could launch another attack, the heavy suite doors swung open for a second time. Jamal stepped over the threshold, his dark, tailored suit impeccable, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. He held a thick stack of manila folders bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Flanking him on either side were two fully uniformed federal police officers, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. Jamal stepped completely into the VIP recovery suite, the two federal officers moving with practiced precision to secure the heavy door behind him. He did not spare a single glance for Patricia, who was currently frozen in mid-rant, her mouth hanging open in sheer shock. Jamal walked with deliberate, measured steps directly to the foot of Spencer's hospital bed. He unlatched his heavy metallic briefcase and set it squarely on the mattress right over Spencer's legs. Jamal turned his head slightly toward the two uniformed officers officially establishing the record for the room. "Officers, I am Jamal Sterling, lead forensic accountant contracted directly by the hospital's board of directors, now acting as an embedded operative for the United States Department of Justice Financial Crimes Division." Patricia finally found her voice, her tone shrill and frantic. "Get out of this room right now. My son just survived open heart surgery. He is in critical recovery. You cannot interrogate a medical patient. He is awake alert, and his attending surgeon is standing right there. Jamal replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that commanded absolute authority. He looked over at me. Dr. Lawson is the patient legally competent to receive federal service. The patient's neurological function is perfectly intact. I confirmed, crossing my arms and stepping back to give Jamal the floor. He is fully capable of comprehending his reality. Jamal popped the dual locks on the briefcase. The sharp mechanical clack echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a massive, heavily indexed stack of documents, tossing them onto the mobile tray table swinging over Spencer's lap. "Let us talk about your reality, Spencer." Jamal began, his eyes locking onto the pale, sweating man in the bed. "Let us talk about the Montgomery Family Trust, the one you have been using as a shield your entire adult life. The one you bragged about to every board member, every investor, and every woman you ever tried to manipulate." Spencer swallowed hard. The cardiac monitor beside him began to beep with a rapid, anxious rhythm. "My trust is perfectly legal. It is managed by offshore fiduciaries. It is managed by a network of shell companies that collapsed exactly 48 hours ago," Jamal corrected instantly. He pulled out a large, oversized ledger sheet covered in highlighted red ink and held it up for Spencer to see. "These are your bank statements. These are offshore routing numbers from the Cayman Islands, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. And these are the heavily forged tax documents your mother filed to hide the massive gaping hole in your liquidity." Patricia lunged forward, her acrylic nails flashing as she tried to swipe the papers from Jamal's hand. "Do not look at those, Spencer. They are completely fabricated. This man is a fraud." One of the federal officers immediately stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on the butt of his sidearm. "Ma'am, step back from the evidence or you will be restrained and removed from the premises." Patricia recoiled, her chest heaving, her eyes darting frantically toward the door. She realized in that split second that she had entirely lost control of the room. Jamal did not miss a beat. He leaned over the bed, bringing his face mere inches from Spencer's. "That $50 million trust fund you were bragging about, the one that supposedly unlocks upon your marriage or your untimely death. It is completely leveraged, Spencer. It does not actually exist." Spencer's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. He gritted his teeth against the pain in his chest, trying to sit up. "What are you talking about?" "The principal is tied up in real estate and hospital development bonds. It is liquid upon the marital trigger, my mother assured me." "Your mother lied to you," Jamal stated, his voice dropping into a register of glacial calm. "You and your mother embezzled millions of dollars from your own investors. You siphoned venture capital meant for the new pediatric wing, generated fake vendor invoices, and funneled the cash directly into your personal accounts to keep your fake billionaire lifestyle afloat. You bought yachts, you bought sports cars, you bought penthouses, all using highly leveraged collateral that you did not actually own." Jamal pulled out a master summary sheet, slamming it down on Spencer's chest. "The $50 million isn't an asset, Spencer. It is a debt. You used the trust as collateral for federal loans. You are deeply, irreparably in default." Spencer stared at the paper, his lips trembling. The numbers stared back at him, massive negative figures followed by federal penalties, compound interest, and wire fraud charges. He looked up at his mother, his voice a hoarse, ragged croak. "Mom, what is he talking about? You said the trust was secure. You said the marriage clause would release the cash and clear our books." Patricia averted her eyes, her jaw locked tight, her hands shaking violently at her sides. She could not look her son in the eye. The entire Montgomery empire was nothing but a hollow shell of vanity and federal fraud, and the walls had just completely caved in. Jamal straightened his tie, looking down at Spencer with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "The trust unlocking at marriage did not mean you gained $50 million, Spencer. It was a poison pill. Your mother drafted the bylaws specifically so that the moment you legally tied yourself to another person, the primary liability of that massive federal debt transferred directly to your new legal spouse. It was a mechanism to offload your criminal liability onto a gullible target." At that exact moment, the heavy door to the VIP suite slowly pushed open. Kelsey crept into the room, her face pale, her hands nervously clutching the strap of her designer purse. She had obviously sneaked past the security desk, attempting to slink in and do immediate damage control after my revelation in the lobby. She needed to smooth things over with Spencer, to play the devoted, terrified wife who had simply panicked under pressure. She froze just inside the threshold, taking in the federal officers, the scattered financial documents, and the absolute despair radiating from the hospital bed. Jamal turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto the new bride. He gestured toward her with a manicured hand. "Ah, Mrs. Montgomery," Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute damning clarity. "Impeccable timing. We were just discussing the specific terms of your husband's marital trust." Kelsey stood paralyzed, her eyes darting from the police to Jamal, to Spencer's horrified face. "What trust?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one you just married into," Jamal replied smoothly, pulling the official marriage certificate from his briefcase and holding it up. "You see, Kelsey Spencer is not a multimillionaire. He is a bankrupt felon facing decades in federal prison. And by signing this marriage certificate, you did not become a wealthy socialite." Jamal let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, ensuring every single word landed with maximum devastating impact. "By signing that document, you became equally legally liable for a $50 million federal fraud debt." Kelsey's knees visibly buckled. The designer purse slipped from her shoulder, hitting the linoleum floor with a heavy thud. She reached out her hands, grasping desperately at the doorframe to keep herself from physically collapsing. The color completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She had not secured a luxury lifestyle. She had not won the lottery. She had eagerly, aggressively signed her own financial death warrant. She had married into a $50 million black hole, and the United States government was already in the room to collect. Kelsey stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble, the realization of a $50 million federal debt completely overriding her nervous system. She looked at Jamal, then at the DOJ documents, and finally at Spencer, who was cowering against his hospital pillows. The pristine, elegant facade of the new Mrs. Montgomery vanished entirely, replaced by raw, unhinged ferocity. With a guttural, ear-piercing shriek, Kelsey snapped. She lunged forward, her hands hooking into the collar of Spencer's hospital gown. She shook him violently, ignoring the frantic beeping of his cardiac monitor and his weak cries of pain. "You tricked me!" she screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You bankrupt, pathetic loser! You told me I was marrying a billionaire. You told me the trust was liquid. You ruined my entire life." Patricia let out a feral roar of her own. Seeing her precious, fragile son being assaulted was the breaking point for the Montgomery matriarch. She lunged across the room, grabbing a thick handful of Kelsey's heavily highlighted hair. With a vicious, adrenaline-fueled yank, Patricia ripped Kelsey away from the bed. Kelsey yelped in pain as she flew backward, her designer heels catching on the linoleum. She crashed hard into a rolling stainless steel cart of medical supplies. The cart tipped over with a deafening clatter, sending sterile gauze, plastic syringes, and saline bags scattering across the floor. "Get your filthy hands off my son!" Patricia shrieked, standing over her new daughter-in-law with her fists clenched. "You greedy, worthless parasite. You thought you could just waltz in and take our fortune. You were nothing but a convenient dumping ground for our liabilities." Kelsey scrambled to her feet, her expensive dress torn at the shoulder, her hair an absolute rat's nest. She did not back down. She launched herself at Patricia, tackling the older woman into a bank of leather visitor chairs. The VIP suite instantly descended into absolute violent chaos. They clawed at each other, slapping, scratching, and tearing at expensive fabrics. "You set me up!" Kelsey roared, pinning Patricia against the armrest and slapping her across the face. "You needed a scapegoat for the feds. You used me. I helped you humiliate Paige at the wedding. I played the perfect bride so everyone would focus on the drama instead of looking into the firm's empty accounts. I did everything you asked to make her look like a jealous failure." Patricia bucked upward, shoving Kelsey off her and delivering a sharp kick to her shin. "You were a willing participant, you cheap gold digger. You only cared about the payout. You smiled and posed for the cameras because you wanted the status. You were too stupid to ever ask to see the actual ledgers. You deserve the debt." I stood near the heavy wooden door, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not move a single muscle to intervene. Beside me, Jamal simply adjusted his suit jacket, his expression a mask of cool professional amusement. I watched the two women who had made it their absolute mission to destroy my confidence, humiliate me publicly, and erase my career tear each other apart like rabid animals. They crashed into a tray table, sending Spencer's water pitcher smashing to the floor. The irony was breathtaking. They had spent months coordinating a sophisticated psychological attack against me, trying to paint me as the unstable, bitter ex-fiancé. Now they were destroying a hospital room, screaming confessions of their own fraud and deceit in front of two federal officers. I simply watched the trash take itself out. "I should have let him die on the table!" Kelsey shrieked, grabbing a handful of Patricia's pearl necklace and yanking hard. The strand broke, sending expensive white pearls bouncing across the tile. If he flatlined, the debt would have died with him. "You both deserve to rot in prison." The two federal officers exchanged a brief professional glance. They had allowed the combatants to incriminate themselves on the official record for long enough. Moving with swift tactical precision, the officers stepped into the fray. "Enough!" The first officer commanded, grabbing Kelsey by the upper arms and easily peeling her off Patricia. He spun her around, pressing her firmly against the wall. Kelsey thrashed against his grip, sobbing hysterically about her ruined credit and her stolen youth, but the officer held her perfectly still. The second officer hoisted Patricia to her feet. The matriarch was panting heavily, her face scratched, her pristine image entirely decimated. She tried to yank her arm away, but the officer locked his fingers around her wrist, forcing her to stand down. The room fell into a heavy, ragged silence, broken only by Kelsey's jagged sobbing and the steady rhythmic beep of Spencer's heart monitor. Spencer lay in the bed, pale and trembling, his eyes darting frantically around the ruined suite. His mother was restrained. His wife was pinned to a wall. His fake empire was officially ash. The lead officer adjusted his utility belt. He did not look at the two women. Instead, he reached to his back hip and pulled out a heavy pair of stainless steel handcuffs. The metallic clinking sound commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He walked with slow, deliberate steps directly over to Spencer's hospital bed. Spencer shrank back against the pillows, his breathing turning shallow and panicked. "Wait," he croaked, raising a weak hand. "I am a patient. I just had open heart surgery. You cannot do this." The officer stopped at the edge of the mattress, his face devoid of any sympathy. "Spencer Montgomery, you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. You will remain under police guard until you are fit for transport." The sharp metallic clack of the handcuff locking around the stainless steel bed rail echoed with absolute finality. Spencer stared at his restrained wrist, the heavy steel biting into his pale skin. The reality of his situation crashed down on his recovering body with the force of a falling building. He did not just lose his fake fortune. He was not just publicly humiliated. He was going to a federal penitentiary. Spencer broke down completely, his chest heaving with ugly, wet sobs that violently strained his fresh sternotomy incisions. The cardiac monitor shrieked a rapid, erratic warning, the jagged green lines spiking as his heart rate skyrocketed in tandem with his total physical and mental collapse. Patricia watched the federal officer secure her golden boy. Her manicured hand, still firmly restrained by the second officer, twitched with impotent rage. Then her eyes snapped toward me. The feral, unhinged fury that had just fueled a physical brawl with Kelsey instantly evaporated, replaced by a sickening, manufactured desperation. She twisted against the officer's grip, straining to step closer to me. "Paige," she gasped, her voice cracking with forced theatrical emotion. "Paige, you have to do something, please." I did not move a single muscle. I maintained my position near the heavy wooden door. My posture relaxed, my expression carved from absolute ice. "You are a top surgeon," Patricia pleaded, the entitlement bleeding effortlessly through her fake tears. "You make millions. You have the liquid assets. Post his bail. Pay for the defense lawyers. Look at him, Paige. You know how fragile he is. He cannot survive in a federal holding facility with a healing heart. You loved him. We were going to be family. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her demand hung in the sterile, heavily air-conditioned air of the VIP suite. She had spent the last 2 years actively trying to destroy my career, mocking my background, and plotting to use my surgical income to fund her son's fraudulent lifestyle. Less than an hour ago, she had openly accused me of trying to murder him on the operating table. Now cornered by federal agents, she was demanding I empty my bank accounts to save him from the consequences of his own felonies. A short, sharp laugh escaped my lips. It was a cold, humorless sound that sliced right through the heavy tension in the room. "My money is tied up, Patricia," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Every single liquid asset I possess has recently been reallocated into a highly strategic portfolio." Patricia blinked her brow, furrowing in panicked confusion. "What are you talking about?" "He needs cash right now. He needs legal representation." I stopped just a few feet away from her, tilting my head to study her pathetic, ruined expression. "I am talking about the Montgomery estate in Medina. The sprawling waterfront property you have been using to host your elite charity galas. The house that has been secretly underwater for 3 years." Patricia's jaw went slack. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her chalky and aged. "I did not just discover your fraud, Patricia," I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal, perfectly enunciated whisper. "I capitalized on it. When Jamal uncovered the sheer volume of your defaulted loans, I made a few heavily funded calls. I used my millions to purchase the exact debt collection agency that currently holds the highly leveraged mortgage on your primary residence." I watched the realization detonate behind her eyes. Her breath hitched in her throat. "I do not just know your secrets," I stated, letting a slow, devastating smirk curve my lips. "I own your debt. I own the roof over your head. I own you. And my first act as your primary creditor will be filing the immediate foreclosure paperwork tomorrow morning. You are going to be homeless before the weekend." A strangled gasp escaped Patricia's throat. Her knees buckled, her entire body going limp. The federal officer had to firmly grip her upper arms just to keep her standing. She was completely, utterly ruined. The high society matriarch had been reduced to a penniless squatter in a matter of seconds. I turned my attention back to the bed. Spencer was staring at me, his face slick with cold sweat. His sobs had quieted into pathetic, shallow hiccups. He looked incredibly small, a weak, fraudulent boy chained to a hospital bed, permanently stripped of his lies. I reached into the deep pocket of my blood-splattered surgical scrubs. My fingers brushed against the small velvet box I had been carrying around for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final strike. I pulled it out and flipped the lid open. The engagement ring caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the VIP suite. The massive stone glittered with aggressive brilliance. It was the ring Spencer had presented to me on bended knee, the ring his mother had constantly bragged about to her country club friends as a priceless family heirloom. I pinched the band between my thumb and forefinger, pulling it from the velvet cushion. I walked to the edge of the bed and casually tossed it onto Spencer's heavily bandaged chest. It landed with a dull, pathetic thud against his hospital gown. "By the way," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent room, "I had it appraised during my medical conference in Geneva last month. I wanted to make sure it was properly insured before the wedding." Spencer flinched as the ring settled over his heart. He refused to look at me, his eyes squeezing shut in ultimate crushing humiliation. "A cubic zirconia," I announced to the room, letting the words hang heavily in the air for Kelsey, Patricia, Jamal, and the federal officers to hear. A completely worthless piece of manufactured glass set in cheap rhodium-plated sterling silver. Retail value approximately $150. Kelsey, still pinned against the drywall by the first officer, let out a harsh, barking laugh of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "You needed a high-earning surgeon to fund your fake billionaire lifestyle, but you couldn't even respect me enough to buy a real ring for your designated scapegoat," I sneered, leaning over the cold metal of the bed rail. "You are a cheap, pathetic fraud right down to the jewelry." Spencer turned his face away, burying his head into the sterile hospital pillow, completely broken. The absolute destruction of the Montgomery family was complete. Their money was gone. Their freedom was gone. Their pride was entirely eradicated. I stood tall, feeling the crushing weight of the past 2 years finally lift from my shoulders. I had not just survived their trap, I had dismantled it piece by piece and buried them in the rubble. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a high-pitched, vibrating screech. Patricia thrashed wildly against the federal officer holding her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. She had lost her money, her home, and her son to the federal government. The only thing she had left was her desperate, venomous spite. "You will pay for this!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the hospital corridor outside the suite. "You think you have won, you arrogant, vindictive little bitch. I will destroy you." I simply raised an eyebrow, entirely unmoved by her tantrum. "You have absolutely nothing left to destroy me with, Patricia. I know the chairman of this hospital." She roared, her eyes bulging with manic desperation. "I have sat on the charity board for a decade. I know every single member of the executive committee. I will go straight to the top. I will have your medical license revoked. I will have you fired and blacklisted across the entire country for abusing a patient." The echoing silence that followed Patricia's manic threat was shattered by the sharp squeak of rubber soles against the linoleum. Nicole pushed her way past the federal officers stationed at the threshold, her arms wrapped around a thick stack of cheap flattened cardboard moving boxes. She marched directly into the center of the ruined VIP suite, stopping just inches from where Patricia was trembling with rage. With a highly satisfied, theatrical flick of her wrists, Nicole tossed the heavy stack of cardboard. The boxes landed with a dull, heavy smack right on top of Patricia's scuffed designer shoes. "You might want to start packing," Patty Nicole said, a razor-sharp smile spreading across her face. "We brought these up from the loading dock. Figured you would need a head start." Patricia stared down at the ugly brown cardboard, her brain completely failing to process the insult. She looked up, her face contorting. "What is the meaning of this, you insolent little receptionist? Pick those up right now." Jamal stepped forward effortlessly, blocking Patricia's line of sight to Nicole. He reached into his briefcase one final time and extracted a thick, blue-backed legal document. The official seal of the state court was stamped heavily in red ink across the top right corner. He held it out, suspending the paper exactly at Patricia's eye level. "The Medina estate was just the beginning of our asset recovery strategy," Mrs. Montgomery Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling professionalism. "The offshore shell companies you used to hide Spencer's embezzled funds were cross-collateralized. When the primary loans defaulted, the entire financial house of cards collapsed." Patricia refused to take the paper. She crossed her arms, her chest heaving. "I do not care what fake documents you printed out. I am not looking at that." Jamal did not flinch. He simply dropped his arm, letting the document fall onto the top of the cardboard boxes at her feet. "That is a formal court-stamped eviction notice for the downtown luxury penthouse." Jamal continued, his tone entirely conversational. "The condo you claim as your primary residence. The property you proudly showcased in Architectural Digest last month. The title was held by a subsidiary trust that Spencer completely drained to cover his bad market bets." Spencer let out a pathetic, muffled groan from the hospital bed, his handcuffed wrist clinking against the metal rail as he buried his face deeper into the pillow. "Page's newly acquired debt collection agency bought the defaulted loans for pennies on the dollar," Jamal explained, gesturing cleanly toward me. "We are executing the foreclosure immediately. The bank has already seized the accounts. The building's management has been notified. Your key fobs have been electronically deactivated. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises before the county sheriff physically removes you and whatever possessions you can fit into those boxes." Patricia's eyes darted frantically from the document on the floor to Jamal and then finally to me. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her absolute ruin was suffocating her. She was losing her son to a federal penitentiary, her fake billionaire daughter-in-law was pinned to the wall by law enforcement, and she was officially homeless. With a sudden guttural scream of raw fury, Patricia dropped to her knees. She snatched the blue-backed legal document from the top of the boxes. She gripped the thick paper in her manicured hands, her knuckles turning white, as she prepared to violently tear the court order into 1,000 pieces. "I would strongly advise against that," Jamal said, his voice cracking through the room like a whip. Patricia froze her hands, shaking violently, a small tear already forming at the top of the page. Tearing up a court-ordered mandate is a direct violation of state law, Jamal informed her, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, and doing so while standing less than 3 feet away from 2 federal law enforcement officers is an immediately arrestable offense. Do it, Patricia. Rip the paper. Give them a reason to put you in handcuffs right next to your son. The lead officer casually shifted his weight, his hand resting significantly on his utility belt. Patricia let out a ragged, humiliated gasp, her hands unclenched. The slightly torn eviction notice fluttered from her fingers, landing back onto the flattened cardboard. She slowly stood up, her knees visibly knocking together. Her pristine, untouchable image was completely obliterated. Her hair was tangled, her clothes were rumpled, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. But Patricia Montgomery was a cornered viper, and cornered vipers always strike. She reached into her ruined designer coat and pulled out her smartphone. Her thumb smashed aggressively against the glass screen, navigating her contacts with manic desperation. She held the device up in the air like a weapon, her eyes locking onto mine with an unhinged, venomous glare. "You think you own me?" Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic adrenaline. "You think you can buy my debt and force me into the street? You think you can orchestrate my son's arrest in a hospital bed and face zero consequences?" I watched her entirely unbothered, my arms still crossed over my chest. "Call whoever you want." "Patricia, I am calling the chairman of the hospital board of directors." Patricia snarled, her finger hovering over the dial button. "Arthur Sterling. He is a personal friend. He sits at my dinner table. He funded the very surgical wing you are currently standing in. I am putting him on speakerphone right now, Paige. I want you to hear the exact moment your medical license is revoked. I want you to listen while I end your entire existence." She slammed her thumb onto the call button and hit the speaker icon. The loud electronic ringing echoed sharply off the sterile walls of the VIP suite. Once, twice. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating and heavy. Spencer stopped sobbing, turning his head to watch the phone in his mother's hand. Kelsey held her breath against the wall. On the third ring, the line clicked open. Arthur. Patricia cried out, her voice instantly pivoting from manic rage to a frantic, breathless plea for help. "Arthur, it is Patricia Montgomery. You have to help me. Dr. Paige Lawson has completely lost her mind. She is abusing my son. She is orchestrating a federal ambush in a recovery suite. You need to fire her this exact second." The line was completely silent for a heavy, agonizing moment. Then a deep, tired voice crackled through the phone's small speaker. "Patricia, I strongly suggest you lower your voice. You are making a fool of yourself." Patricia tightened her grip on the smartphone, her knuckles turning bone white against the expensive casing. Arthur Sterling's sharp, undeniable rebuke did not register in her panic-addled brain. She operated purely on the toxic arrogance she had wielded like a weapon for decades. She simply could not process a reality where she was not the most powerful person in the room. "I will not lower my voice," Patricia shrieked into the receiver, her eyes blazing as she glared directly at me. "I am demanding immediate disciplinary action against your chief of surgery. Dr. Paige Lawson is engaging in grossly unprofessional conduct. She is actively harassing a VIP patient in a sterile recovery suite. She brought armed federal agents into a restricted medical environment to execute a personal vendetta. Fire her right now, Arthur. Terminate her contract immediately and have hospital security escort her off the premises, or I will pull every single dime of my family's funding from your foundation." The heavy silence on the line was deafening. The 2 federal officers exchanged a look of pure, unrestrained amusement. Jamal Sterling casually checked his gold wristwatch, completely unbothered by the matriarch's empty, desperate threat. When Arthur finally spoke, his voice projected through the small speaker with a cold, brutal finality. "Mrs. Montgomery, you have absolutely no funding left to pull," Arthur stated. "Jamal has already provided the executive committee with a comprehensive briefing regarding your defaulted accounts, your highly leveraged assets, and your impending federal indictment. Your leverage does not exist. Your checkbook is entirely empty." Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Arthur cut her off with surgical precision. And even if you were still a donor in good standing, I cannot fire Dr. Lawson. Arthur continued. None of us can. You are the chairman of the board of directors. Patricia spat back, her voice trembling violently. You answer to the donors. You have the ultimate authority. I have the authority to manage the clinical staff, Arthur corrected smoothly. I do not have the authority to dismiss the hospital's primary infrastructure provider. During her scheduled medical conference in Geneva last month, Dr. Lawson did not just attend surgical seminars. She utilized a private holding company to quietly become the majority shareholder of Aura Medical Tech. The words hung heavily in the air. I watched the realization slowly attempt to penetrate the thick, reinforced wall of Patricia's delusion. She shook her head, confusion warring with her blinding rage. What does some foreign tech company have to do with my son's surgeon? Patricia demanded, her voice cracking. Aura Medical Tech is the exclusive supplier of every single piece of robotic surgical equipment in this facility. Arthur explained, his tone laced with a distinct layer of professional respect. They hold the international patents on our imaging systems, our automated retractors, and the proprietary software that runs the entire intensive care unit. By taking controlling interest of Aura, Dr. Lawson effectively bought the infrastructure of our entire surgical division. We lease the equipment directly from her holding company. She does not just work in the surgical wing, Patricia. She technically owns it. We answer to her. The line clicked dead. The sharp, monotonous dial tone echoed endlessly through the VIP suite. Patricia stood absolutely paralyzed. The manic, commanding energy that had fueled her entire existence simply evaporated. Her jaw slacked. Her fingers went entirely numb. The expensive smartphone slipped from her grasp, plummeting toward the linoleum floor. It struck the hard tile and shattered instantly, the glass screen spiderwebbing into 100 jagged pieces. The violent destruction of the device perfectly mirrored the absolute irreversible destruction of the Montgomery Empire. Patricia sank to her knees, staring blankly at the flattened cardboard boxes Nicole had thrown at her feet. She had nothing. No money, no home, no power. The woman she had tormented, mocked, and dismissed as a working-class charity case was now her absolute superior in every conceivable metric. From the hospital bed, the harsh synthetic beep of the cardiac monitor accelerated into a frantic, terrifying rhythm. Spencer was hyperventilating. His chest heaved violently against his fresh surgical incisions. He was handcuffed to the metal rail, a federal prisoner watching his entire reality completely invert. He had spent his adult life pretending to be a billionaire, using fake trust funds, and embezzled cash to assert his dominance over everyone around him. I possessed the genuine, undeniable wealth and absolute power he had only ever counterfeited. Spencer's eyes darted wildly around the room, locking onto Kelsey. His new wife was still securely pinned against the wall by the federal officer. She was a massive liability now. She was a $50 million anchor dragging him straight to the bottom of the ocean. He turned his head frantically, his wide, desperate eyes finding mine. Paige, Spencer gasped, his voice cracking as he strained against the heavy steel handcuffs. Paige, listen to me. Please, you have to listen. I stepped closer to the bed, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated apathy. I am listening, Spencer. Make it quick. The federal marshals have a tight transport schedule to keep. I was manipulated. Spencer choked out, tears streaming freely down his pale, sweating face. He pointed a shaking finger directly across the room at Kelsey. She forced me into this. She preyed on my financial stress. She made me sign that prenup. She actively tried to let me die on the operating table today so she could steal my money. She is a monster. I never wanted her. Kelsey let out a feral, outraged scream, struggling violently against the officer's unyielding grip. You lying, spineless coward. You begged me to marry you to unlock the trust. You orchestrated this entire fraud. Spencer ignored her entirely, his total focus locked onto my face. The desperation in his eyes was absolute. He was a drowning man trying to grab onto the very person he had intentionally pushed off the lifeboat. I love you, Paige, Spencer begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, whimpering plea. I have always loved you. The wedding to Kelsey was a mistake. A massive, catastrophic mistake. But I can fix this. My lawyers can file an emergency annulment right now. We never consummated the marriage. The union is completely fraudulent. I can erase her completely. He pulled against the cuffs, reaching his free hand toward me. Take me back! Paige Spencer cried, the monitor screaming in the background as his physical panic peaked. You are powerful now. You have the resources. You can clear these federal charges. We can go back to how it was supposed to be. I will annul this fake marriage right now, and I will marry you. I swear it on my life. Just get these cuffs off me and get me out of here. I walked right up to the edge of Spencer's hospital bed, looking down at his pathetic handcuffed form. His chest was heaving, the fresh surgical incisions visible beneath the gaping neckline of his sterile gown. The arrogant, untouchable heir I had almost married was completely gone, replaced by a sniveling, desperate criminal trying to bargain his way out of a federal penitentiary. He strained against the stainless steel rail, his pale wrist turning raw and red from the friction of the heavy metal cuff. You have to believe me. Paige Spencer begged, his voice cracking into a high, frantic whine. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted to humiliate you. It was them. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at his mother, who was still kneeling on the floor amidst the scattered cardboard boxes, and then toward the hallway where Kelsey was actively struggling against the federal marshal. They brainwashed me, Paige. He continued, his words spilling out in a rapid, desperate torrent. My mother forced me into this corner. She told me the feds were closing in and we needed a distraction to hide the missing funds. And Kelsey preyed on my financial stress. She practically forced me to sign those marriage papers. I was completely manipulated. I was a victim in my own family. I always loved you. Only you. Just tell the officers you forgive me, Paige. Please, get me out of these cuffs. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single word of sympathy or outrage. I simply stared at him, my expression devoid of any human warmth. The absolute cowardice of a man willing to sacrifice his own mother and his new bride to save his own skin was staggering but entirely expected. I turned my head slightly, catching Jamal's eye. My attorney did not need a verbal command. Moving with smooth, practiced efficiency, Jamal reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out his sleek silver iPad. He handed it to me, tapping the screen once to awaken the device. The VIP recovery suite was equipped with a massive 70-inch smart television mounted directly opposite Spencer's bed, intended for patient entertainment and reviewing radiological scans. I tapped a few buttons on the iPad screen, wirelessly syncing the tablet to the hospital monitor. The large screen flickered to life, instantly plunging the bright, sterile hospital room into the dim, moody ambiance of a high-end downtown cigar lounge. Spencer froze. The frantic babbling completely died in his throat. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he were about to go into cardiac arrest. The security footage was crystal clear, capturing a private velvet-roped booth from a high angle. The timestamp in the corner indicated the video was recorded exactly 3 months prior. Long before the wedding disaster, long before the federal raid, and long before his open-heart surgery. On the screen, Spencer was lounging in a tufted leather booth surrounded by 3 of his most elite, arrogant friends. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand and a freshly lit cigar in the other. He looked the picture of untroubled, inherited wealth. Jamal had employed a highly specialized forensic audio firm to isolate and enhance the sound from the heavy ambient noise of the lounge. Spencer's voice echoed through the hospital room speakers, crisp, clear, and dripping with malicious entitlement. I am telling you guys, the wedding is just a necessary operational expense. The digitized version of Spencer laughed, taking a slow sip of his drink. Paige has absolutely no idea about the firm's liquidity issues. She is completely blind to it. One of his friends leaned forward, a cynical smirk on his face. But what happens when the creditors start looking at her assets? She is a top-tier surgeon, Spence. You are going to drag her down with you. Spencer scoffed on the video, waving his cigar dismissively. That is exactly the point. She is just a dumb, loyal workhorse. She works 80-hour weeks and just hands me her investment portfolio to manage. I will string her along until the offshore trust unlocks next quarter. Once I secure the capital transfer, I will dump her at the altar to create a media circus file for immediate damages based on the wedding costs, and keep her surgeon's salary as alimony while she deals with the public fallout. She is nothing but a high-earning shield for the feds. The video continued to play, capturing the raucous, cruel laughter of his friends, but the damage was already done. I tapped the iPad screen, plunging the television back into heavy, oppressive darkness. I slowly lowered the tablet, turning my gaze back to the bed. Spencer went dead silent. His mouth hung open, his eyes wide and vacant. The desperate pleading charade of the victimized fiancé was completely shattered. He had no excuses left, no one left to blame. His own voice had just convicted him in front of a room full of federal agents. The lead police officer standing near the window let out a low, impressed whistle. He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a small black notepad and a pen, and clicked it open. The sound was sharp and loud in the completely silent room. Fascinating strategy. Mr. Montgomery, the officer stated, his voice laced with heavy professional disgust. He began writing rapidly on the small lined pages. I am going to go ahead and add premeditated marital fraud, attempted financial extortion, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud to the official list of recommended charges for the district attorney. That video alone just added a mandatory 10 years to your sentencing guidelines. From the doorway, a sharp, ragged gasp broke the silence. Kelsey was still detained in the hallway, pressed firmly against the wall by the second federal marshal, but the door was wide open. She had heard every single word echoing from the television speakers. Her heavily highlighted hair fell across her face, masking her eyes, but her entire body was shaking with a brand new, terrifying realization. She slowly lifted her head, staring past the officer and directly at Spencer. "You were going to do it to me, too," Kelsey whispered, her voice trembling with absolute, horrifying clarity. Spencer swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze, his eyes darting frantically toward the floor. "You did not marry me to save the company." Kelsey realized, her voice growing louder, sharper. "You married me because you needed a new shield. The feds were closing in faster than you expected, and you needed a warm body to take the fall when the accounts ran dry. You were planning to string me along, use my signature on those fraudulent loan documents, and then ruin me the exact same way you planned to ruin Paige." Kelsey lunged forward against the officer's hold, her manicured fingers clawing at the empty air toward the hospital bed. "You absolute sociopath!" she screamed, tears of genuine, terrified rage streaming down her face. "You set me up for federal prison. You were going to let me take the fall for everything." The marshal easily restrained her, pulling her back into the hallway, but her screams continued to echo down the corridor. She had thought she was outsmarting a billionaire. She had believed she was securing a lifetime of luxury. Instead, she had willingly strapped herself into the passenger seat of a crashing plane, driven by a man who had already secured his own parachute. Patricia remained frozen on the floor amid the cardboard boxes. She stared at her son, her golden boy, the heir to the Montgomery empire, realizing he had been perfectly willing to sacrifice her freedom to save himself. I looked down at Spencer one final time. The monitor continued its erratic, panicked rhythm. He was trapped. He was exposed. He was entirely alone. "I suggest you get comfortable with those handcuffs, Spencer," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "You are going to be wearing them for a very, very long time." The federal marshal in the hallway shifted his weight to unclip his radio, his grip on Kelsey slackening for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. Fueled by blind, animalistic panic, Kelsey violently twisted her shoulder, breaking away from the officer's hold. She stumbled into the VIP suite, her expensive designer dress tearing further along the seam. Her meticulously styled hair hung in tangled, sweaty clumps around her face, and thick black streaks of mascara tracked down her cheeks. The haughty, untouchable bride who had smirked at me just hours ago was entirely gone. She lunged directly at me, her hands desperately reaching out to grab the fabric of my surgical scrubs. "Paige, please." Kelsey sobbed, her voice a ragged, breathless wail. "Please, you have to help me." I took a swift, deliberate step backward, allowing her outstretched hands to grasp nothing but empty air. She collapsed onto her knees, right in front of me, sobbing so hard her entire body convulsed. "I will do anything," Kelsey begged, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. "I will testify against them. I will give the feds every single text message, every email, every recording I have of Patricia and Spencer planning this. Just loan me the money to pay off the debt. You are a millionaire now. You own the hospital wing. 50 million is nothing to you. Paige, please loan me the money to pay off the debt. I will do anything. I was manipulated too." I stared down at her weeping, pathetic form. The sheer lack of accountability was almost impressive. She had actively participated in a sophisticated scheme to destroy my life, and the moment the ship began to sink, she was begging for a spot on my life raft. I looked her up and down with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You were not manipulated," I stated, my voice echoing with icy surgical precision. "You were greedy and you bet on the wrong horse." Kelsey flinched as if I had physically struck her, but I did not stop. "You knew exactly what you were doing." I continued, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You smelled money and you wanted the status. You smiled for the cameras, you wore the stolen diamonds, and you gladly helped Patricia try to humiliate me because you thought it secured your place in high society. You did not care about Spencer. You did not care about his heart. You only cared about the payout you thought was waiting for you in that offshore trust. You made a calculated, predatory business decision, Kelsey. The market simply crashed on you." "But I am ruined," she gasped, wrapping her arms around her stomach as she rocked back and forth on her knees. "My credit is destroyed. My life is over. I cannot survive federal prison. I will be in debt for the rest of my natural life. You have to save me." "I am a cardiac surgeon, Kelsey," I replied coldly. "I save lives. I do not save fraudulent investments." The federal marshal stepped into the room, reaching down to grab Kelsey by the arm and haul her back to her feet. She went limp, forcing him to drag her upright. She continued to weep, a continuous, unbroken sound of total defeat. However, I added, raising a single finger to pause the marshal before he could pull her back into the hallway. "Before the federal government officially seizes your remaining non-existent assets, there is one final piece of hospital business we need to conclude." I turned my head and gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the doorway. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the VIP suite. It was Mr. Harrison, the chief financial administrator for the hospital. He possessed a demeanor entirely devoid of emotion, operating solely on ledgers, liabilities, and billing codes. In his hands, he held a thick, heavy clipboard secured with a massive stack of itemized hospital invoices. He walked directly over to me and extended the clipboard. I took it, flipping past the first 2 pages of billing summaries. Kelsey sniffled, her panicked eyes darting between me and the hospital administrator. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fresh terror. "This is the consequence of your greed," I explained, stepping toward her and holding out the heavy clipboard. Kelsey refused to take it. She shrank back against the federal marshal, shaking her head rapidly. "When you rushed to the courthouse this morning to legally bind yourself to Spencer Montgomery, you thought you were securing your legal right to a massive trust fund," I said, tapping the thick stack of papers. "But marriage is a legally binding contract that covers both assets and liabilities. You became his legal next of kin." I took a slow step closer, forcing her to look at the paperwork. "And then, when he collapsed, you made another calculated decision," I continued. "You thought you were being clever. You thought by refusing to sign the paperwork, you were protecting yourself from any potential fallout if he died on the operating table. But your refusal actually bypassed our entire insurance protocol." Kelsey stopped crying. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization began to form in her mind. Because Spencer's premium health insurance was tied to a fraudulent corporate account that the federal government seized and froze. This morning, his policy was instantly flagged and rejected. I explained, delivering the facts with lethal clarity. "And since you refused to sign the surgical consent, but you are still his legally wedded wife, you are 100% financially responsible for this uninsured, out-of-network emergency robotic open-heart surgery." I grabbed her trembling hand, forcing her fingers to close around the edge of the clipboard. The itemized list includes the emergency room trauma response, the specialized cardiac surgical team, the proprietary robotic equipment fees, the premium anesthesia, the extended intensive care unit recovery, and this luxury VIP suite. I listed smoothly, watching the color completely drain from her face. Total cost, I announced, pointing directly to the bold red number printed at the bottom of the final page. $1.2 million. Payment is due in 30 days. Kelsey stared at the number. Her eyes widened to an unnatural, terrifying degree. Her mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The clipboard slipped from her numb fingers, crashing loudly against the linoleum floor, sending the itemized invoices scattering across the room. Her eyes rolled back into her head. All the tension instantly vanished from her body. She slumped forward, slipping entirely out of the marshal's grip, and fainted dead away in the hallway. Kelsey hitting the linoleum floor with a heavy thud barely registered on my radar. I stepped smoothly over her sprawled, unconscious form, leaving the federal marshal to deal with the ruined bride and the crushing reality of her newfound seven-figure debt. My part in the VIP suite was officially concluded. I walked down the sterile corridor, the frantic beeping of Spencer's cardiac monitor fading into the distance. It was time to shed the surgical scrubs. I retreated to my private executive office, locking the door behind me. The blue cotton uniform fell to the floor, replaced by a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray designer suit. I slipped on my heels, fastening my watch with methodical precision. The armor was on. The surgeon was gone. The majority shareholder had arrived. By the time I grabbed my phone from the desk, it was vibrating endlessly with notifications. Jamal had executed his part of the strategy flawlessly. The sealed federal indictments had just gone public, and the local Seattle press corps had descended upon the hospital like a pack of starving wolves. Word of the Montgomery family's spectacular financial implosion had leaked to every major news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. Looking out my third-floor window, I could see the chaos unfolding. Dozens of news vans, satellite trucks, and eager journalists were already swarming the perimeter of the medical center, their camera lenses aimed at every possible exit. Down on the ground floor, Patricia Montgomery was attempting a desperate, highly undignified escape. Stripped of her commanding aura, her bottomless checkbook, and the loyal sycophants who usually paved her way, she knew walking out the front doors was career suicide. She bypassed the grand main lobby entirely. Opting instead for the service corridors, she made her way toward the loading dock exit near the cafeteria supply bays. It was a dark concrete space, smelling of diesel exhaust and industrial cleaning supplies. But Jamal had anticipated her cowardice. He had conveniently tipped off a hungry local anchor about the matriarch's intended escape route. Patricia pushed open the heavy metal service door, clutching her designer handbag like a physical shield, only to be instantly blinded by a solid wall of high-intensity camera lights. Microphones bearing the logos of every major network were thrust into her face. Reporters shouted over one another, their voices echoing loudly in the concrete loading bay, demanding statements about the seized offshore accounts, the fraudulent wedding, and her son's imminent incarceration. Patricia stumbled backward, raising a hand to block the glaring lights. She was trapped. Cornered and desperate, Patricia defaulted to the only survival strategy she knew. She lied. She stood tall, smoothing her wrinkled silk blouse, and adopted the haughty, victimized tone of a wronged aristocrat. "My son is a victim," Patricia declared loudly, her voice trembling with manufactured righteous outrage. "This entire spectacle is an orchestrated, malicious medical conspiracy. Dr. Paige Lawson, a woman my son rightfully left at the altar, is a bitter, unstable, jealous ex-fiancé. She manipulated his medical records, arranged a fraudulent, unnecessary surgery, and coordinated with corrupt federal officials to steal our family's legacy. She is actively trying to murder my son on the operating table out of pure spite. We are filing a massive lawsuit against her and this hospital immediately." The journalists eagerly recorded every single word, capturing her frantic, wide-eyed desperation on live television. The skepticism in the air was palpable, but a scandal of this magnitude was ratings gold. They pressed closer, shouting more questions, asking for proof of this alleged conspiracy. Patricia opened her mouth to spin another layer of delusion, but the attention of the press suddenly shifted. I did not yell from the loading dock. I did not engage in a screaming match with a delusional woman. I simply walked out of the hospital's grand main entrance flanked by Jamal and approached the secondary cluster of reporters stationed near the fountain. I moved with absolute unbothered calm. My posture was straight, my expression completely serene. As the cameras pivoted away from the frantic matriarch in the alley and locked onto me, I did not offer a tearful defense or a fiery emotional rebuttal. Jamal unzipped his leather briefcase and handed me a small velvet-lined box. Inside sat 50 identical encrypted black flash drives. I stepped up to the microphones and calmly distributed the drives to the closest journalists. Everything you need regarding the Montgomery federal embezzlement case, the fraudulent marriage contract, and their complete, undeniable bankruptcy is right here on these drives, I stated, my voice projecting clearly over the clamor of the crowd. You will find bank records, offshore wire transfers, and the unedited security footage of Spencer Montgomery actively confessing to the entire scheme. The truth requires no theatrics or conspiracy theories. I suggest you review the files before printing Mrs. Montgomery's fairy tales. The reporters scrambled to grab the flash drives, instantly plugging them into their laptops and tablets. But before anyone could even open the first folder, the final crushing blow landed. A fleet of unmarked black federal SUVs pulled up directly to the hospital steps, sliding perfectly into the frame of the live evening news broadcast. Heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles, bypassing me entirely. They marched with lethal purpose straight toward the loading dock, where Patricia was still standing. Patricia's face drained of all remaining color as the lead agent grabbed her arm, spinning her around to forcefully slap heavy steel handcuffs over her wrists. You are under arrest for accomplice liability, aiding and abetting corporate fraud, and obstruction of justice. The agent barked, his voice carrying over the live broadcast. The untouchable matriarch of the Montgomery Empire was hauled away in front of dozens of flashing cameras, her legacy permanently reduced to a prime-time perp walk. 2 days later, the scratch of my fountain pen across thick watermarked paper was the only sound in Jamal's sprawling top-floor legal office. I sat at his massive mahogany conference table, flanked by Jamal on my right and Nicole on my left. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline gleamed under a rare, cloudless sky. I carefully signed my name on the final dotted line, effectively terminating the last remaining shared lease on a minor storage unit I had forgotten Spencer and I even shared. Jamal collected the stack of documents, aligning the edges with a sharp, satisfying tap against the polished wood. Every minor joint checking account, every shared utility bill, and every residual legal tie connecting me to Spencer Montgomery was now officially dissolved. I was entirely legally free. The asset seizure is moving faster than the federal prosecutors initially projected, Jamal stated, sliding the signed documents into a thick leather folio. Patricia Montgomery's remaining liquid assets, including her private art collection, the offshore shell companies, and the deed to her Aspen ski lodge, have been fully frozen. The bankruptcy court is expediting the liquidation process to prevent any further hemorrhaging of funds. Where exactly are the proceeds going? I asked, leaning back in the plush leather chair. Directly to the victims? Jamal confirmed, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. The Department of Justice is prioritizing the restitution of the employee pension funds that Spencer and Patricia systematically embezzled. The working-class staff members, the factory workers, the administrative assistants they robbed to fund their lavish lifestyle are getting every single cent back with interest. Nicole let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. She walked over to the mahogany bar cart situated in the corner of the office, retrieving a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon chilling in a silver bucket. To the absolute, undeniable destruction of the Montgomery facade, Nicole declared, popping the cork with a festive, echoing crack. She poured the pale, bubbling liquid into 3 crystal flutes, handing one to me and one to Jamal. We raised our glasses, the crystal chiming together with a bright, clear resonance. The champagne tasted like absolute victory. Miles away from our high-end celebration, the atmosphere was drastically different. The heavy, reinforced steel door of a secure federal prison hospital ward slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang. Spencer Montgomery was unceremoniously wheeled into the bleak, windowless room by two burly, indifferent corrections officers. The plush, luxurious VIP suite at my hospital was gone, replaced by peeling green linoleum, harsh fluorescent lights, and the overwhelming scent of industrial bleach and iodine. He was aggressively hoisted from the transport gurney onto a rigid, uncomfortable institutional bed. One of the officers immediately secured a heavy steel cuff around Spencer's right ankle, locking it directly to the metal bed frame with a heavy snap. Spencer winced, clutching his chest where the fresh surgical incisions burned with a dull, throbbing ache beneath a scratchy, thin cotton blanket. He looked up, his hollow, sunken eyes scanning the small, sterile room. There were no nurses rushing to offer him pain medication. There were no assistants bringing him fresh water. There was only a heavily barred, frosted window set high into the concrete wall, letting in a meager sliver of gray light. He was entirely, inescapably alone, permanently stripped of his name, his wealth, and his manufactured power. At that exact same moment across town, Kelsey was experiencing her own spectacular freefall. The heavy oak door of her leased luxury penthouse swung open, but it was not a concierge delivering packages. It was a team of aggressive, no-nonsense debt collectors flanked by a local sheriff's deputy. Kelsey backed away, her hands trembling as a neon orange eviction notice was slapped directly onto the center of her front door. She had spent the last 48 hours ignoring calls from creditors, hoping the massive hospital invoice I handed her was just a terrible nightmare. The reality was currently invading her living room. Two men brushed past her carrying thick cardboard boxes. They immediately went to her custom walk-in closet, unceremoniously dumping her collection of limited-edition designer bags, red-soled shoes, and diamond tennis bracelets into the boxes. "You cannot take those," Kelsey shrieked, lunging forward to grab the handle of a crocodile skin purse. "Those are mine. I am a Montgomery." The sheriff's deputy stepped squarely in her path, blocking her access. "You are an uninsured debtor with $1.2 million in outstanding medical liabilities," the deputy corrected in a bored, monotonous voice. "Everything of value in this apartment is being repossessed to satisfy the primary creditors. Grab a coat, ma'am. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises." Kelsey sank to the hardwood floor, weeping hysterically, as her carefully curated, heavily financed life was packed up and carried out the front door. She possessed zero marketable skills, zero remaining assets, and zero wealthy friends willing to take her in. She had traded her dignity for a counterfeit billionaire, and the final bill had just come due. Back in Jamal's office, I took another slow sip of my champagne, enjoying the warmth spreading through my chest. The chaos of the past 72 hours had finally settled into a profound, unshakable peace. The Montgomery Empire was dust. My career was secure. My future belonged entirely to me. Suddenly, the sharp, persistent ringing of my personal cell phone broke the quiet ambiance of the office. I reached into my purse, glancing at the caller ID. The screen displayed an encrypted international number originating from Geneva, Switzerland. Frowning slightly, I set my champagne flute down on the table and swiped the screen to answer. "Dr. Paige Lawson speaking." I answered, my tone instantly shifting back to professional clarity. "Dr. Lawson, good afternoon." A distinguished, heavily accented voice echoed through the speaker. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne, President of the World Health Organization." I sat up straighter, my eyes locking with Nicole's across the table. "Dr. Thorne, to what do I owe the pleasure? Word of your exceptional performance under extreme hostile duress has reached our executive board." Dr. Thorne explained, his tone carrying immense professional respect. "Your flawless execution of a high-risk robotic cardiac procedure while simultaneously navigating a federal raid is nothing short of legendary in the global medical community. We have been actively searching for someone with your precise level of surgical genius and absolute unshakable composure." He paused for a fraction of a second, allowing the heavy weight of his words to settle over the line. The World Health Organization is launching a new multi-billion-dollar global initiative to standardize advanced surgical technologies in developing nations. Dr. Thorne continued. We are officially offering you the position of Global Director of Robotic Surgical Innovation. When can you fly to Geneva? I told him I would be on the next available flight. Exactly 30 days later, the stark, brutal reality of our divergent paths settled into absolute permanence. The heavy steel doors of the Federal Penitentiary Mess Hall slid shut with a deafening metallic clang. Spencer Montgomery shuffled forward in the serving line, his posture permanently slouched beneath the weight of a neon orange jumpsuit. The fabric was stiff, scratchy, and stamped with a black inmate identification number across the back. He stared down at his battered plastic tray as a cafeteria worker slapped a scoop of gray, unrecognizable mush next to a slice of stale bread. Spencer had spent his entire adult life dining on Wagyu beef and imported caviar funded entirely by stolen money and a counterfeited legacy. Now his culinary world was reduced to heavily processed starch and chlorinated tap water. His medical license had been permanently revoked by the state board. His offshore trust funds were fully liquidated. His carefully manufactured pride was utterly obliterated. He sat down at a chipped metal table entirely ignored by the hardened inmates around him, chewing his terrible food in complete agonizing silence. 1,000 miles away, the relentless beeping of a commercial deep fryer provided the soundtrack to Kelsey's new existence. She stood behind the greasy counter of a 24-hour drive-thru, wearing a highly flammable polyester uniform and a mandatory tightly secured hairnet. Her pristine manicured nails were gone, replaced by cracked cuticles and red burns from splashing cooking oil. A frustrated customer barked an order through the drive-thru speaker, causing Kelsey to flinch as she punched the cheap plastic buttons on the register. Her manager, a teenager half her age, yelled at her to move faster. Kelsey wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead, her eyes drifting toward the break room where her discount purse sat in a dented metal locker. Inside that purse was her latest pay stub. The state had legally mandated a massive wage garnishment, automatically seizing 80% of her minimum wage earnings to slowly chip away at the $1.2 million medical debt she had legally inherited. Her designer bags had been completely repossessed. Her luxury apartment had been seized by creditors. She had bet her entire existence on a golden ticket, and the house had taken absolutely everything she had. In a high-security county jail cell, Patricia Montgomery sat on a thin, lumpy mattress, staring blankly at a cinder block wall. She was awaiting trial for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and accessory to medical malpractice. Her tailored silk suits had been replaced by standard-issue gray scrubs. The cell was freezing, echoing continually with the harsh sounds of slamming bars and shouting guards. She had no leverage left to pull, no subordinates to command, and no charitable foundation to hide behind. She was simply inmate number 47, isolated, and stripped of the empire she had ruthlessly guarded for decades. The contrast could not have been more absolute. I stood backstage at the Palais des Congrès in Paris, taking a slow, grounding breath as the ambient hum of a massive international audience filtered through the heavy velvet curtains. The world outside the Montgomery family's toxic orbit was brilliant, expansive, and entirely mine. The World Health Organization had organized this gala to officially launch their global surgical initiative, and I was the keynote focus of the evening. I smoothed the lapels of my custom-tailored midnight blue designer suit. I did not wear white. I did not wear anything that resembled the timid, accommodating bride who had once walked down an aisle hoping for validation. I wore the armor of a woman who owned her own infrastructure, her own talent, and her own future. The stage director gave me a sharp nod, pointing toward the stairs. I walked out from behind the curtains, stepping into the blinding, magnificent glow of a dozen stage spotlights. The auditorium was packed with thousands of the world's leading surgical innovators, hospital administrators, and international health diplomats. As I approached the crystal podium, the applause swelled, rolling through the massive venue like thunder. I looked out into the front row. Jamal sat there looking incredibly sharp in a bespoke tuxedo, giving me a respectful, deeply proud nod. Next to him sat Nicole, wearing a stunning emerald gown, smiling so broadly her eyes were shining with unshed tears. They were not my blood. They had no legal obligation to me. But they had stood between me and absolute ruin. They had wielded their expertise, their loyalty, and their fierce protection when my world had collapsed. The toxic, suffocating dynamic of being the unappreciated scapegoat was completely dead and buried. Looking at Nicole and Jamal, I realized with absolute certainty that family is not something you are born into. It is something you earn and something you choose. My real family was right here in the front row. The applause slowly died down, leaving a heavy anticipatory silence in the grand auditorium. I adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of international medical pioneers. I did not think of Spencer's orange jumpsuit. I did not think of Kelsey's hairnet, or Patricia's cinderblock cell. I thought only of the empire I had secured and the lives I was going to change. I smiled, leaning slightly into the microphone, delivering my closing monologue to the global audience and directly to the camera broadcasting the feed across the world. Some people believe that revenge is about destruction. They are wrong. The sweetest revenge isn't breaking the people who betrayed you. It's letting them break themselves with their own greed while you step over their ruins to build an empire they could never afford to enter. I smiled, stepping back from the podium. The crowd erupted into a deafening, unified standing ovation, the sound filling the air as the stage lights flared brilliantly and the screen faded to black. Reflection on true self-worth. A profound lesson from these narratives is that your self-worth is never defined by your family's inability to recognize it. Breaking free from a toxic scapegoat dynamic requires accepting that genuine love should never be conditional. True healing begins when you stop seeking validation from those who consistently belittle you, choosing instead to channel that energy into building an independent, authentic life. You hold the power to establish firm boundaries and surround yourself with a chosen family that actually celebrates your success. Share your own experiences of setting boundaries and finding peace in the comments below.